Statesman. I'm really much indebted to you, Theodorus, for introducing me to Theaetetus and also to our visitor. And perhaps, Socrates, your debt will be 3 times as great when they complete both the statesman and the philosopher for you. Well, yes and no, shall we say, my dear Theodorus, that we've heard the best arithmetician and geometer putting it like that? How do you mean, Socrates? Because you assume that each of the 3 were to be assigned equal worth, when in fact they differ in value by more than can be expressed in terms of mathematical proportion. Well said, Socrates, by our god Ammon, and just rebuke. You've remembered your arithmetic very well to bring me up on my mistake like that. As for you, I'll get my own back for this on another occasion. But turning to our guest, don't you give up at all on obliging us, but whether you choose the statesman first or the philosopher, make your choice and go through him in his turn. That, Theodorus, is what we must do, since we have tried our hand once, and we must not desist until we come to the end of what we have in hand. But I have a question. What should I do about Theaetetus here? In what respect? Should we give him a rest and substitute for him young Socrates here, who trains with him, or what's your advice? As you say, make the substitution. Since they are young, they'll put up with any sort of exertion more easily if they take a rest. What's more, my friend, both of them seem somehow to have a certain kinship with me. One of them, you all say, is like me in the way he looks. As for the other, he is called and designated by the same name as I am, and that produces a certain relatedness. Well, we must always be eager to recognize those akin to us by talking to them. With Theaetetus, I myself got together in discussion yesterday, and I have just now heard him answering questions. Whereas neither applies in Socrates' case, we must take a look at him too. He'll answer me on another occasion. For now, let him answer you. I'll go along with that. Socrates, do you hear what Socrates says? Yes. Then do you agree to it? Absolutely. It seems there is no obstacle on your side, and perhaps there should be even less on mine. Well then, after the sophist, it seems to me that the 2 of us must search for the statesman. Now tell me, should we posit in the case of this person too, that he is one of those who possess knowledge, or what assumptions should we make? That's what we should assume. In that case, we must divide the various sorts of knowledge as we did when we were considering the previous individual. Perhaps so. But it's not in the same place, Socrates, that I think I see a cut. Why not? It's in a different place. Yes, apparently. So in what direction will one discover the path that leads to the statesman? For we must discover it, and after having separated it from the rest, we must impress one character on it, and having stamped a single different form on the other turnings, we must make our minds think of all sorts of knowledge there are as falling into 2 classes. That, I think, is actually for you to do, visitor, not for me. But Socrates, it must also be a matter for you when it becomes clear to us what it is. You're right. Well then, isn't it the case that arithmetic and some other sorts of expertise that are akin to it don't involve any practical actions, but simply provide knowledge? That's so. Whereas for their part, the sorts of expertise involved in carpentry and manufacture as a whole have their knowledge, as it were, naturally bound up with practical actions, and use it to complete those material objects they cause to come into being from not having been before. What of that? Well, divide all cases of knowledge in this way, calling the one sort practical knowledge, the other purely theoretical. I grant you these as 2 classes of that single thing, knowledge taken as a whole. Then shall we posit the statesman and king and slave master and the manager of a household as well as one thing, when we refer to them by all these names? Or are we to say that they are as many sorts of expertise as the names we use to refer to them? Or rather, let me take this way, and you follow me. What way is that? This one. If someone who is himself in private practice is capable of advising a doctor in public employment, isn't it necessary for him to be called by the same professional title as the person he advises? Yes. Well then, won't we say that the person who is clever at giving advice to a king of a country, although he is himself a private individual, himself has the expert knowledge that the ruler himself ought to have possessed? We will. But the knowledge that belongs to the true king is the knowledge of kingship. Yes. And isn't it the case that the person who possesses this, whether he happens to be a ruler or a private citizen, in all circumstances, in virtue of his possession of the expertise itself, will correctly be addressed as an expert in kingship? That's fair. Next, a household manager and slave master are the same thing. Of course. Well then, surely there won't be any difference so far as ruling is concerned between the character of a large household on the one hand and the bulk of a small city on the other. None. So in answer to the question we were asking ourselves just now, it's clear that there is one sort of expert knowledge concerned with all these things, whether someone gives this the name of expertise in kingship or statesmanship or household management. Let's not pick any quarrel with him. I agree, why should we? But this much is clear, that the power of any king to maintain his rule has little to do with the use of his hands or his body in general in comparison with the understanding and force of his mind. Clearly. Then do you want us to assert that the king is more closely related to the theoretical sort of knowledge than to the manual or generally practical sort? Of course. In that case, we shall put all these things together, the statesman's knowledge and the statesman, the king's knowledge and the king as one, and regard them as the same. Clearly. Well, would we be proceeding in the right order if after this we divided theoretical knowledge? Certainly. So look closely to see if we can detect some break in it. Of what sort, tell me? Of this sort. We agreed, I think, that there is such a thing as an art of calculation. Yes, and I suppose it belongs absolutely among the theoretical sorts of expertise. Quite. Because once it recognizes that there is a difference between numbers, there surely isn't any further job we'll assign to it than judging what it has recognized. No, certainly not. And all master builders too, they don't act as workers themselves, but manage workers. Yes. Insofar, I suppose, as what the master builder provides is understanding rather than manual labour. Just so. It would be right to say, then, that he has a share in the theoretical sort of knowledge. Certainly. But it belongs to him, I think, once he has given his professional judgment, not to be finished or to take his leave in the way that the expert in calculation took his, but to assign whatever is the appropriate task to each group of workers until they complete what has been assigned to them. That's correct. So both all sorts of knowledge like this and all those that go along with the art of calculation are theoretical, but these two classes of knowledge differ from each other insofar as one makes judgments while the other directs. They appear to do so. So if we divided off two parts of theoretical knowledge as a whole, referring to one as directive and the other as making judgments, would we say that it had been divided suitably? Yes, at least according to my view. But if people are doing something together, it is enough if they agree with one another. Quite. So for as long as we are sharing in the present task, we should say goodbye to what everyone else may think. Of course. So tell me, in which of these two sorts of expertise should we locate the expert in kingship? In the one concerned with making judgments, as if he were some sort of spectator, or shall we rather locate him as belonging to the directive sort of expertise, seeing that he is master of others? In the second, of course. Then we should need to look at directive expertise in its turn to see if it divides somewhere. And to me it seems that it does so somewhere in this direction, in the way that the expertise of the retail dealer is distinguished from that of the self-seller, of producer who sells his own products. So the class of kings appears set apart from the class of heralds. How so? The retailer, I think, takes over someone else's products, which have previously been sold and sells them on for a second time? Absolutely. Well then, the class of heralds takes over directions that have been thought up by someone else, and itself issues them for a second time to another group. Very true. So, shall we mix together the expertise of the king with that of the interpreter, the person who gives the time to the rowers, the seer, the herald, and many other sorts of expertise related to these, just because they all have the feature of issuing directions? Or do you want us to make up a name in line with the analogy we were using just now, since in fact the class of self-directors happens pretty much to be without a name of its own? Should we divide these things this way, locating the class of kings as belonging to the self-directing sort of expertise, and taking no notice of all the rest, leaving someone else to propose another name for them? For we set up our investigation in order to find the person who rules, not his opposite. Absolutely. Well then, since this is at a certain distance from those others, distinguished by difference in relation to kingship, we must in turn divide it too, if we still find some cut yielding to us in it. Certainly. And what's more, we seem to have one. Follow on and make the cut with me. Where? All those in control of others that we can think of as employing directions, we shall find them issuing their directions, won't we, for the sake of something coming into being? Of course. And it's not at all difficult to separate into two all of those things that come into being. How? I can imagine that, of all of them taken together, some are inanimate and some are animate. Yes, and it's by these very things that will cut the part of the theoretical which is directive, if indeed we wish to cut it. How? By assigning part of it to the production of inanimate things, part of that of animate things, and in this way it will all immediately be divided in two. I agree absolutely. So then let's leave one of these parts to one side and take up the other, and then let's divide the whole of it into two parts. Which of the two parts do you say we should take up? I suppose it must be the one that issues directions in relation to living creatures, for surely it is not the case that the expert knowledge that belongs to a king is ever something that oversees inanimate things, as if it were the knowledge of the master builder. It is something nobler, which always has its power among living creatures and in relation to just these. Correct. Now, as one can observe, either the production and rearing of living creatures is done singly, or it is a caring for creatures together in herds. Correct. But we'll certainly not find the statesman rearing individual creatures, like some ox driver or groom, but rather resembling a horse breeder or cowherd. It certainly seems so, now you say it. Well then, when it comes to rearing living creatures, are we to call the shared rearing of many creatures together a sort of herd rearing or collective rearing? Whichever turns out to fit in the course of the argument. Well said, Socrates, and if you persevere in not paying serious attention to names, you will be seen to be richer in wisdom as you advance to old age. But now we must do just as you instruct. Do you see how by showing the collective rearing of herds to be twin in form, one will make what is now being sought in double the field, then be sought in half of that? I shall try my hardest. It seems to me that there is a different sort of rearing of human beings, and in turn another sort where animals are concerned. Yes, absolutely. You've made a very keen and courageous division, but let's try to avoid this happening to us again. What sort of thing? Let's not take off one small part on its own, leaving many large ones behind and without reference to real classes. Let the part bring a real class along with it. It's a really fine thing to separate off immediately what one is searching for from the rest if one gets it right, as you thought you had the right division just before and hurried the argument on, seeing it lead into human beings. But in fact, my friend, it's not safe to make thin cuts. It's safer to go along cutting through the middle of things, and that way one will be more likely to encounter real classes. This makes all the difference in relation to philosophical investigations. What do you mean by this, visitor? I must try to tell you still more clearly, Socrates, out of goodwill towards your natural endowments. In the present circumstances, I have to say, it is impossible to show what I mean with absolute completeness, but I must bring it just a little further forward for the sake of clarity. Well then, what sort of thing are you saying we weren't doing right just now in our divisions? This sort of thing. It's as if someone tried to divide the human race into two and made the cut in the way that most people here carve things up, taking the Greek race away as one, separate from all the rest, and to all the other races together which are unlimited in number, which don't mix with one another and don't share the same language, calling this collection by the single appellation barbarian. Because of this single appellation, they expect it to be a single family or class too. Another example would be if someone thought that he was dividing number into two real classes by cutting off the number 10,000 from all the rest, separating it off as a single class, and in positing a single name for all the rest, supposed here too that through getting the name this class too came into existence, a single one apart from the other. But I imagine the division would be done better, more by real classes and more into two, if one cut number by means of odd and even, and the human race in its turn by means of male and female, and only split off Lydians and Phrygians, or anyone else, and ranged them against all the rest, when one was at a loss as to how to split in such a way that each of the halves split off was simultaneously a real class and part. Quite right. But this very thing, how is one to see it more plainly, that class and part are not the same, but different from each other? An excellent response, Socrates. But what you demand is no like thing. We have already wandered far away from the discussion we proposed, and you are telling us to wander even more. Well, as for now, let's go back to where we were, which seems the reasonable thing to do, and these other things we'll pursue like trackers on another occasion when we have the time. However, there is one thing you must absolutely guard against, and that is ever to suppose that you have heard from me a plain account of the matter. Which? That class and part are different from each other. What should I say I have heard from you? That whenever there is a class of something, it is necessarily also a part of whatever thing it is called a class of. But it is not at all necessary that a part is a class. You must always assert, Socrates, that this is what I say, rather than the other way round. I shall do just that. Tell me then about the next thing. What's that? The point from which our digression brought us to where we are now. I think it was pretty much the point at which you were asked how to divide herd rearing, and you said with great keenness that there were two classes of living creatures, one human and a second single one consisting of all the rest, the animals together. True. And to me you appeared then to think that in taking away a part, you had left behind the rest as in its turn a single class, consisting of all of them, because you had the same name, animals, to apply to them all. This too was as you say. And yet, my courageous friend, maybe if by chance there is some other animal which is rational, as for example the crane seems to be, or some other such creature, and which perhaps distributes names on the same principle as you, it might oppose cranes as one class to all other living creatures, and give itself airs, taking all the rest together with human beings and putting them into the same category, which would call by no other name except perhaps animals. So let's try to be very wary of everything of this sort. How? By not dividing the class of living creatures as a whole, in order to lessen the risk of its happening to us. Yes, we must certainly avoid it. Yes, and we were going wrong in this way just at that point. How so? Of that theoretical knowledge which was directive, we had a part, I think, of the class concerned with rearing living creatures, one which was concerned with creatures living in herds, true? Yes. Well then, living creatures as a whole together had in effect already, at that point, been divided by the categories of domesticated and wild, For those that have a nature amenable to domestication are called tame, and those who do not are called wild. Right. But the knowledge we are hunting had to be and still is concerned with tame things, and must be looked for with reference to herd animals. Yes. Well then, let's not divide in the way we did then, looking at everything or in a hurry, just in order to get quickly to statesmanship. It has already put us in the proverbial situation. What situation is that? That by not quietly getting on with dividing properly, we have got to our destination more slowly. Yes, visitor, and a fine situation it is. If you say so. In any case, let's go back and try again from the beginning to divide collective rearings. Perhaps, as we go through it in detail, the argument itself will be better able to reveal to you what you are so keen to find. Tell me this. What? This. I wonder if perhaps you've heard about it from others. You certainly haven't yourself any direct acquaintance, I know, with the instances of domesticated fish rearing in the Nile and in the king's ponds. In ornamental fountains, at any rate, you may perhaps have seen them. Absolutely. I've both seen these and heard about the others from many people. And again, examples of goose rearing and crane rearing, even if you haven't travelled over the plains of Thessaly, you've certainly heard about these and believe that they exist. Of course. Look, it's for this purpose that I've asked you all of this. Of the rearing of herd animals, some has to do with creatures living in water, some also with creatures that live on dry land. It does. Do you agree then that we must split the expert knowledge of collective rearing into two in this way, allocating one of its two parts to each of these, calling one aquatic rearing, the other dry land rearing? I do. And we certainly shan't ask in this case to which of the two sorts of expertise kingship belongs. It's quite clear to anyone. Quite. Everybody would divide the dry land rearing sort of herd rearing. How? By separating it by reference to the winged and what goes on foot. Very true. Well then, mustn't we look for statesmanship in relation to what goes on foot? Or don't you think that practically even the simplest of minds suppose so? I do. And the expertise to do with the management of creatures that go on foot, we must show it being cut into two, like an even number. Clearly. Now it seems that there are two routes to be seen stretching out in the direction of the part towards which our argument has hurried, one of them quicker, dividing a small part off against a large one, while the other more closely observes the principle we were talking about earlier, that one should cut in the middle as much as possible, but is longer. We can go down whichever of the two routes we like. What if I were to ask if it is impossible to follow both? An extraordinary suggestion if you mean both at once, but clearly it is possible to take each in turn. Then I opt for taking both in turn. That's easy, since the part that remains is short. If we had been at the beginning or in the middle of our journey, the instruction would have been difficult to carry out. As it is, since you think we should take this option, let's go down the longer route first. While we are fresher, we'll travel it more easily. Observe the division. Tell me what it is. Of tame things that live in herds, we find those that go on foot naturally divided into two. By what? By the fact that some of them come into being without horns, some with horns. Evidently. Well then, divide the management of creatures that go on foot by assigning it to each of these two parts using a descriptive phrase for the results of the division. For if you want to give them names, it will be more complicated than necessary. How then should it be put? Like this, by saying that when the knowledge that has to do with the management of creatures that go by foot is divided into two, one part is allocated to the horn part of the herd, the other to the hornless part. Let it be put like that, in any case, it's sufficiently clear. Now, as for the next step, it's perfectly obvious to us that the king tends a sort of docked herd of hornless creatures. How couldn't it be clear? So by breaking this up, let's try to assign what falls to him. Yes, certainly. Well, do you want to divide it by the split hooved and the so-called single-hooved, or by interbreeding and non-interbreeding. I think you grasp the point. What's that? That horses and donkeys are naturally such as to breed from one another. Yes, whereas what is still left of the smooth-headed herd of tame creatures is unmixed in breeding, one with another. Quite. Does the statesman, then, seem to take care of an interbreeding or of some non-interbreeding sort? Clearly of the non-mixing sort. This, then, it seems we must separate into two, as we did in the previous case. Indeed we must. Now those creatures that are tame and live in herds have pretty well all now been cut into their pieces, except for two classes. For it is not worth our while to count the class of dogs as among creatures living in herds. No, indeed. But what are we to use to divide the two classes? Something that is absolutely appropriate for Theaetetus and you to use in your distributions, since it's geometry the two of you engage in. What is it? The diagonal, one could say, and then again the diagonal of the diagonal. What do you mean? The nature which the family or class of us humans possesses surely isn't endowed for the purpose of going from place to place any differently from the diagonal that has the power of 2 feet. No. And what's more, the nature of the remaining class has in its turn the power of the diagonal of our power, if indeed it is endowed with 2 times 2 feet. Of course it is. I actually almost understand what you want to show. And there's more. Do we see, Socrates, that there's something else resulting in our divisions that would itself have done well as a comic turn? What's that? That our human class has shared the field and run together with the noblest and also most easy-going class of existing things. I see it turning out very oddly indeed. Well, isn't it reasonable to expect the slowest, or sowest, to come in last? Yes, I can agree with that. And don't we notice that the king looks even more ridiculous when he continues to run along with his herd and has traversed convergent paths with the man who for his part is best trained of all for the easy-going life? Absolutely right. Yes, Socrates, and what we said before in our inquiry about the sophist is now plainer. What was that? That such a method of argument as ours is not more concerned with what is more dignified than with what is not, and neither does it at all despise the smaller more than the greater, but always reaches the truest conclusion by itself. It seems so. Well then, after this, so that you don't get in before me and ask what the shorter way is, the one we spoke of earlier, to the definition of the king, shall I go first and show you the way? Very much so. Then I say that in this case one must immediately distribute what goes on foot by opposing the 2-footed to the 4-footed class, and when one sees the human still sharing the field with the winged alone, one must go on to cut the 2-footed herd by means of the non-feathered and the feathered, and when it has been cut, and the expertise of human herding has then and there been brought into the light, one must lift the expert in statesmanship and kingship like a charioteer into it and install him there, handing over the reins of the city as belonging to him, and because this expert knowledge is his. That's well done, and you've paid me the account I asked for as if it were a debt, adding the digression as a kind of interest, making up the sum. Come on then, let's go back to the beginning and gather together from there to the end our account of the name of the expertise of the statesman. Absolutely. Well then, of theoretical knowledge we had at the beginning a directive part, and of this, the section we wanted was by analogy said to be self-directing. Then again, rearing of living creatures, not the smallest of the classes of self-directing knowledge, was split off from it, then a herd rearing from rearing of living creatures, and from that in turn rearing of what goes on foot, and from that, as the relevant part, was cut off the expertise of rearing the hornless sort. Of this in turn the part must be woven together as not less than triple, if one wants to bring it together into a single name, calling it expert knowledge of rearing of interbreeding creatures. The segment from this, a part relating to a two-footed flock, concerned with rearing of human beings, still left on its own, this very part is now what we were looking for, the same thing we call both kingly and statesmanlike. Absolutely. Is it really the case, Socrates, that we have actually done this, as you have just said? Done what? Given a completely adequate response to the matter we raised? Or is our search lacking especially in just this respect, that our account of the matter has been stated in a certain way, but has not been finished off to complete perfection? How do you mean? I shall try now to show, for both of us, still more clearly just what I am thinking of. Please go ahead. Well then, of the many sorts of expertise to do with rearing herds that appeared in our view just now, statesmanship was one, and was care of some one sort of herd. Yes. And our account defined it not as rearing of horses or of other animals, but as knowledge of the collective rearing of human beings. Just so. Then let us look at the difference between all herdsmen on the one hand and kings on the other. What's that? Let us see if in the case of any other herdsman anyone who has the title of another expertise claims or pretends to share the rearing of the herd with him. How do you mean? Like this, that merchants, farmers, millers and bakers, all of them, and gymnastic trainers too, and doctors as a class, all of these, as you well know, would loudly contend against the herdsmen concerned with things human, whom we called statesmen, that they care for human rearing, not merely for that of human beings in the herd, but for that of the rulers as well. Well, would they be right? Perhaps. That we'll consider. But what we know is that with a cowherd no one will dispute about any of these things, but the herdsman is by himself rearer of the herd, by himself its doctor, by himself its matchmaker, as it were, and sole expert in the midwife's art when it comes to the births of offspring and confinements. Again, to the extent that the nature of his charges allows them to partake in play and music, no one else is more capable of comforting them and soothing them with his incantations, performing best as he does the music that belongs to his flock with instruments or with unaccompanied voice. And it's the same way with all other herdsmen, true? Quite right. So how will our account of the king appear to us right and complete, when we posit him as sole herdsman and rearer of the human herd, singling him out on his own from among tens of thousands of others who dispute the title with him? There's no way in which it can. Then our fears a little earlier were right, when we suspected that we should prove in fact to be describing some kingly figure, but not yet accurately to have finished the statesman off until we remove those who crowd round him, pretending to share his herding function with him, and having separated him from them, we reveal him on his own, uncontaminated with anyone else. Yes, absolutely right. Well then, Socrates, this is what we must do, if we are not going to bring disgrace on our argument at its end. That is something we must certainly avoid doing at all costs. Then we must travel some other route, starting from another point. What route is that? By mixing in, as one might put it, an element of play. We must bring in a large part of a great story, and as for the rest, we must then, as in what went before, take away part from part in each case, and so arrive at the furthest point of the object of our search. So should we do it? Absolutely. In that case, pay complete attention to my story as children do. You certainly haven't left childish games behind for more than a few years. Please go ahead. Then I'll begin. There have occurred in the past, and will occur in the future, many of the things that have been told through the ages. One is the portent relating to the quarrel between Atreus and Thyestes. I imagine you remember hearing what people say happened then. You're referring perhaps to the sign of the golden lamb. Not at all. Rather to that of the changing of the setting and rising of the sun and the other stars. It's said that they actually began setting in the region from which they now arise, and rising from the opposite region, and that then, after having given witness in favour of Atreus, the god changed everything to its present configuration. Yes, indeed, they do say this as well. And what's more, we've also heard from many about the kingship exercised by Cronus. Yes, from a great many. And what of the report that earlier men were born from the earth and were not produced from each other? This too is one of the things that have been told through the ages. Well, all these things together are consequences of the same state of affairs, and besides these thousands of others still more astonishing than they. But through the great lapse of time since then some have been obliterated, while others have been reported in a scattered way, each separate from one another. But as for the state of affairs that is responsible for all of these things, no one has related it, and we should relate it now, for once it has been described it will be a fitting contribution towards our exposition of the king. I very much like what you say. Go on, and leave nothing out. Listen then. This universe the God himself sometimes accompanies, guiding it on its way and helping it move in a circle, while at other times he lets it go, when its circuits have completed the measure of the time allotted to it. Then it revolves back in the opposite direction of its own accord, being a living creature and having had intelligence assigned to it by the one who fitted it together in the beginning. This backward movement is inborn in it from necessity, for the following reason. What reason exactly? Remaining permanently in the same state and condition, and being permanently the same, belongs only to the most divine things of all, and by its nature, body is not of this order. Now the thing to which we have given the name of heavens and cosmos certainly has a portion of many blessed things from its progenitor, but on the other hand it also has its share of body. In consequence, it is impossible for it to be altogether exempt from change, although as far as is possible, given its capacities, it moves in the same place, in the same way, with a single motion, and this is why it has reverse rotation as its lot, which is the smallest possible variation of its movement. To turn itself by itself forever is, I dare say, impossible for anything except the one who guides all the things which, unlike him, are in movement, and for him to cause movement now in one way, now in the opposite way, is not permitted. From all of these considerations it follows that one must neither say that the cosmos is always itself responsible for its own turning, nor say at all that it is turned by God in a pair of opposed revolutions, nor again that it is turned by some pair of gods whose thoughts are opposed to each other. It is rather what was said just now, which is the sole remaining possibility, that at times it is helped by the guidance of another divine cause acquiring life once more and receiving a restored immortality from its craftsman, while at other times, when it is let go, it goes on its own way under its own power, having been let go at such a time as to travel backwards for many tens of thousands of revolutions because of the very fact that its movement combines the effects of its huge size, perfect balance, and its resting on the smallest of bases. It certainly seems that everything you have gone through is very reasonable. Then, drawing on what's just been said, let's reflect on the state of affairs we said was responsible for all those astonishing things. In fact, it's just this very thing. What's that? That the movement of the universe is now in the direction of its present rotation, now in the opposite direction. How do you mean? We must suppose that this change is, of the turnings that occur in the heavens, the greatest and the most complete turning of all. Yes, it certainly seems so. We must suppose, then, that at the time the greatest changes also occur for us who live within the universe. That too seems likely. And don't we recognize that living creatures, by their nature, have difficulty in tolerating changes that are at once large, great in number, and of all different sorts? Certainly we do. Necessarily, then, there occur at that time cases of destruction of other living creatures on a very large scale, and humankind itself survives only in small numbers. Many new and astonishing things happen to them, but the greatest is the one I shall describe, one that is in accordance with the retrogradation of the universe at the time when its turning becomes the opposite of the one that now obtains. What kind of thing do you mean? First, the visible age of each and every creature, whatever it was, stopped increasing, and everything that was mortal ceased moving in the direction of looking older. Instead, it changed back in the opposite direction and grew, as it were, younger, more tender. The white hairs of the older men became black, and in turn the cheeks of those who had their beards became smoother again, returning each to his past bloom. The bodies of those in their puberty, becoming smoother and smaller each day and night, went back to the form of new-born children, which they came to resemble both in mind and body, and from then on they proceeded to waste away until they simply disappeared altogether. As for those who died a violent death at that time, the body of the dead person underwent the same effects and quickly dissolved to nothing in a few days. But, visitor, how did living creatures come into being in that time, and in what way were they produced from each other? Clearly, Socrates, reproduction from one another was not part of the nature of things then. It was the earth-born race, the one said to have existed once that existed then, returning to life again from the earth. It was remembered by our first ancestors, who lived in the succeeding time but bordered on the ending of the previous period, growing up at the beginning of this one. They became our messengers for the accounts of the earth-born, which are nowadays wrongly disbelieved by many people. For I think we must reflect on what is implied by what we have said. If old men went back to being children, it follows that the people should be put together again from the dead, there in the earth, and come back to life. They would be following the reversal of things, with coming into being, turning round with it to the opposite direction, and since they would, according to this argument, necessarily come into existence as earth-born, they would thus acquire that name and have that account given of them, all of those, them, that is, whom God did not take off to another destiny. Yes, quite. This does seem to follow on what went before. But as for the life which you say there was in the time of Cronus's power, was it in that period of rotation or in this one? For it clearly turns out that the change affecting the stars and the sun occurs in each period. You have been keeping up with the argument well. As for what you asked about everything springing up of its own accord for human beings, it belongs least to the period that now obtains. It too belonged to the one before. For then the god began to rule and take care of the rotation itself as a whole, and as for the regions in their turn, it was just the same, the parts of the world order having everywhere been divided up by gods ruling over them. As for living things, divine spirits had divided them between themselves like herdsmen by kind and by herd, each by himself providing independently for all the needs of those he tended, so that none of them was savage, nor did they eat each other, and there was no war or internal dissent at all. And as for all the other things that belong as consequences to such an arrangement, there would be tens of thousands of them to report. But to return to what we have been told about a human life without toil, the origin of the report is something like this. A god tending them, taking charge of them himself, just as now human beings, themselves living creatures, but different and more divine, pasture other kinds of living creatures more lowly than themselves, and given this tendance, they had no political constitutions, nor acquired wives and children, for all of them came back to life from the earth, remembering nothing of the past. While they lacked things of this sort, they had an abundance of fruits from trees and many other plants, which grew not through cultivation, but because the earth sent them up of its own accord. For the most part they would feed outdoors, naked and without bedding, for the blend of the seasons was without painful extremes, and they had soft beds from abundant grass that sprang from the earth. What you are hearing about then, Socrates, is the life of those who lived in the time of Cronus. As for this one, which they say is the time of Zeus, the present one, you are familiar with it from personal experience. Would you be able and willing to judge which of the two is more fortunate? Not at all. Then do you want me to make some sort of decision for you? Absolutely. Well then, if with so much leisure available to them, and so much opportunity to get together in conversation, not only with human beings but also with animals, if the nurslings of Cronus used all these advantages to do philosophy, talking both with animals and with each other, and inquiring from all sorts of creatures whether any one of them had some capacity of its own that enabled it to see better in some way than the rest, with respect to the gathering of wisdom, the judgment is easy, that those who lived then were far, far more fortunate than those who live now. But if they spent their time gorging themselves with food and drink, and exchanging stories with each other and with the animals of the sort that, even now, are told about them, this too, if I may reveal how it seems to me at least, is a matter that is easily judged. But however that may be, let us leave it to one side, until such time as someone appears who is qualified to inform us in which of these two ways the desires of men of that time were directed in relation to the different varieties of knowledge and the need for talk. We must now state the point of our rousing our story into action in order to move forward and bring what follows to its end. When the time of all these things had been completed and the hour for change had come, and in particular all the earth-born race had been used up, each soul having rendered its sum of births, falling to the earth as seed as many times as had been laid down for each, at that point the steersman of the universe let go, as it were, of the bar of the steering oars, and retired to his observation post. And as for the cosmos, its allotted and innate desire turned it back again in the opposite direction. So all the gods who ruled over the regions together with the greatest divinity, seeing immediately what was happening, let go in their turn the parts of the cosmos that belonged to their charge, and as it turned about and came together with itself, impelled with opposing movements, both the one that was beginning and the one that was now ending, it produced a great tremor in itself, which in its turn brought about another destruction of all sorts of living things. After this, when sufficient time had elapsed, it began to cease from noise and confusion and attained calm from its tremors. It set itself in order into the accustomed course that belongs to it, itself taking charge of and mastering both the things within it and itself, because it remembered so far as it could the teaching of its craftsman and father. At the beginning it fulfilled his teaching more accurately, but in the end less keenly. The cause of this was the bodily element in its mixture, its companion since its origins long in the past, because this element was marked by a great disorder before it entered into the present world order. For from the one who put it together the world possesses all fine things from its previous condition. On the other hand, it both has for itself from that source everything that is bad and unjust in the heavens, and produces it in its turn in living things. So while it reared living things in itself in company with the steersman, it created only slight evils and great goods, but in separation from him, during all the time closest to the moment of his letting go, it manages everything very well, but as time moves on and forgetfulness increases in it, the condition of its original disharmony also takes greater control of it, and as this time ends, comes to full flower. Then the goods it mixes in are slight, but the admixture it causes of the opposite is great, and it reaches the point where it is in danger of destroying both itself and the things in it. It is for this reason that now the God who ordered it, seeing it in difficulties and concerned that it should not, storm-tossed as it is, be broken apart in confusion and sink into the boundless sea of unlikeness, takes his position again at its steering oars, and having turned round what had become diseased and been broken apart in the previous rotation, when the world was left to itself, orders it, and by setting it straight renders it immortal and ageless. What has been described, then, is the end point of everything. As for what is relevant to our showing the nature of the king, it is sufficient if we take up the account from what went before. When the cosmos had been turned back again on the course that leads to the sort of coming into being which obtains now, the movement of the ages of living creatures once again stopped, and produce new effects which were the opposite of what previously occurred. For those living creatures that were close to disappearing through smallness began to increase in size, while those bodies that had just been born from the earth, already grey-haired, began to die again and return into the earth, and everything else changed, imitating and following on the condition of the universe, and in particular there was a change to the mode of conception, birth, and rearing, which necessarily imitated and kept pace with the change to everything. For it was no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth under the agency of others putting it together, but just as the world order had been instructed to be master of its own motion, so too in the same way its parts were instructed themselves to perform the functions of begetting, birth, and rearing so far as possible by themselves under the agency of a similar impulse. We are now at the point that our account has all along been designed to reach, to go through the changes that have occurred in relation to the other animals, and from what causes, would involve a description of considerable length. Those that relate to human beings will be shorter to relate and more to the point. Since we had been deprived of the God who possessed and pastured us, and since for their part the majority of animals, all those who had an aggressive nature, had gone wild, human beings by themselves, weak and defenceless, were preyed on by them, and in those first times were still without resources and without expertise of any sort. Their spontaneous supply of food was no longer available to them, and they did not yet know how to provide for themselves, having had no shortage to force them to do so before. As a result of all of this, they were in great difficulties. This is why the gifts from the gods, of which we have ancient reports, have been given to us, along with an indispensable requirement for teaching and education: fire from Prometheus, crafts from Hephaestus and his fellow craft worker, seeds and plants from others. Everything that has helped to establish human life has come about from these things. Once care from the gods, as has just been said, ceased to be available to human beings, and they had to live their lives through their own resources and take care for themselves, just like the cosmos as a whole, which we imitate and follow for all time, now living and growing in this way, now in the way we did then. As for the matter of our story, let it now be ended, and we shall put it to use in order to see how great our mistake was when we gave our account of the expert in kingship and statesmanship in our preceding argument. So how do you say we made a mistake, and how great was it? In one way it was lesser, in another it was very high-minded, and much greater and more extensive than in the other case. How so? In that when asked for the king and statesman from the period of the present mode of rotation and generation, we replied with the shepherd from the opposite period, who cared for the human herd that existed then, and at that a god instead of a mortal. In that way we went very greatly astray. But in that we revealed him as ruling over the whole city together, without specifying in what manner he does so, in this way, by contrast, what we said was true, but incomplete and unclear, which is why our mistake was lesser than in the respect just mentioned. True. So we should define the manner of his rule over the city. It's in this way that we should expect our discussion of the statesman to reach its completion. Right. It was just for these reasons that we introduced our story, in order that we might demonstrate in relation to herd rearing, not only that as things now stand everyone disputes this function with the person we are looking for, but also in order that we might see more plainly that other person himself whom alone, in accordance with the example of shepherds and cowherds, because he has charge of human rearing, it is appropriate to think worthy of this name, and this name alone. Correct. But in my view, Socrates, this figure of the divine herdsman is still greater than that of a king, and the statesmen who belong to our present era are much more like their subjects in their natures, and have shared in an education and nurture closer to theirs. I suppose you must be right. Yet they will be neither less nor more worth looking for whether their natures are of the latter or of the former sort? Quite. Then let's go back by the following route. The sort of expertise we said was self-directing in the case of living creatures, but which took its care of them not as individuals but in groups, and which we then went on immediately to call herd rearing. You remember? Yes. Well, in a way we missed in our aim at this expertise, for we did not at all succeed in grasping the statesman along with the rest or name him, but he eluded us in our naming, and we did not notice. How so? All the other sorts of herdsmen, I think, share the feature of rearing their several herds, but although the statesman does not, we still applied the name to him, when we should have applied to all of them one of the names that belongs in common to them. What you say is true, if indeed there is such a name. And how would, perhaps, looking after not have been common to them all, without any specification of it as rearing, or any other sort of activity? By calling it some sort of expertise in herd keeping or looking after or caring for, as applying to them all, we could have covered the statesman too as well as the rest, given that this was the requirement our argument indicated. Correct. But in what way would the division following this be made? In the same way as we previously divided herd rearing by footed and wingless, and non-interbreeding and hornless, by dividing herd keeping too by these same things, I think we would have included in our account to the same degree both the present sort of kingship and that in the time of Cronus. It seems so, but again I ask what step follows this? It's clear that if we had used the name herd keeping like this, no one would ever have contended with us on the grounds that there is no such thing as caring at all, in the way that it was then justly contended that there was no sort of expertise available that deserved this appellation of rearing, but that if there really were such a thing, many people had a prior and better claim to it than any of our kings. Correct. But care of the whole human community together, no other sort of expertise would be prepared to say that it had a better and prior claim to being that than kingly rule, which is over all human beings. What you say is correct. But after that, Socrates, do we see that at the very end of our account we again made a large mistake? What sort of mistake? It was this, that even if we had been quite convinced that there was some expertise concerned with the rearing of the two-footed herd, we should certainly not for that reason immediately have called it the expertise of the king and statesman, as if that were the end of the matter. What should we have done? First of all, as we are saying, we should have altered the name, aligning it more with caring for things than with rearing, and then we should have cut this, for it would still offer room for cuts of no small size. Where would they be? I imagine where we would have divided off the divine herdsman on one side and the human carer on the other. Correct. But again, we ought to have cut into two the art of the carer resulting from this apportionment. By using what distinction? That between the enforced and the voluntary. Why so? I think we made a mistake before in this way too, by behaving more simple-mindedly than we should have. We put king and tyrant into the same category, when both they themselves and the manner of their rule are very unlike one another. True. But now, should we set things to rights again, and, as I said, should we divide the expertise of the human carer into two, by using the categories of the enforced and the voluntary? Absolutely. And should we perhaps call tyrannical the expertise that relates to subjects who are forced, and the herd keeping that is voluntary and relates to willing two-footed living things that expertise which belongs to statesmanship, displaying in his turn the person who has this expertise and cares for his subjects in this way as being genuinely king and statesman? Yes, visitor, and it's likely that in this way our exposition concerning the statesman would reach completion. It would be a fine thing for us, Socrates, but this mustn't be just your view alone. I too have got to share it in common with you, and as it is, according to my view, our discussion does not yet seem to have given a complete shape to the king. Just as sculptors sometimes hurry when it is not appropriate to do so and actually lose time by making additions and increasing the size of the various parts of their work beyond what is necessary, so too in our case. I suppose that in order to give a grand as well as a quick demonstration of the mistake in the route we previously took, we thought it was appropriate to the king to give large-scale illustrations. We took upon ourselves an astonishing mass of material in the story we told, so forcing ourselves to use a greater part of it than necessary. Thus we have made our exposition longer, and have in every way failed to apply a finish to our story, and our account, just like a portrait, seems adequate in its superficial outline, but not yet to have received its proper clarity, as it were, with paints and the mixing together of colours. But it is not painting or any other sort of manual craft, but speech and discourse, that constitute the more fitting medium for exhibiting all living things, for those who are able to follow. For the rest, it will be through manual crafts. That much is correct, but show me how you say we have not yet given an adequate account. It's a hard thing, my fine friend, to demonstrate any of the more important subjects without using models. It looks as if each of us knows everything in a kind of dreamlike way, and then again is ignorant of everything when, as it were, awake. What do you mean? I do seem rather oddly now to have stirred up the subject of what happens to us in relation to knowledge. How so? It has turned out, my dear fellow, that the idea of a model itself in its turn also has need of a model to demonstrate it. How so? Explain, and don't hold back for my sake. Explain I must, in view of your own readiness to follow. I suppose we recognize that when children are just acquiring skill in reading and writing, recognize what? That they distinguish each of the individual letters well enough in the shortest and easiest syllables, and come to be capable of indicating what is true in relation to them. Of course. But then once again they make mistakes about these very same letters in other syllables, and think and say what is false. Absolutely. Well then, isn't this the easiest and best way of leading them on to the things they're not yet recognizing? What way? To take them first back to those cases in which they were getting these same things right, and having done that, to put these beside what they're not yet recognizing. By comparing them, we demonstrate that there is the same kind of thing with similar features in both combinations, until the things that they are getting right have been shown, set beside all the ones that they don't know. Once the things in question have been shown like this, and so become models, they bring it about that each of all the individual letters is called both different on the basis that it is different from the others, and the same on the basis that it is always the same as and identical to itself in all syllables. Absolutely right. Well then, have we grasped this point adequately, that we come to be using a model when a given thing, which is the same in something different and distinct, is correctly identified there, and having been brought together with the original thing, brings about a single true judgment about each separately and both together? It seems so. Then would we be surprised if our minds, by their nature, experience this same thing in relation to the individual letters of everything, now, in some cases, holding a settled view with the aid of truth in relation to each separate thing, now, in others, being all at sea in relation to all of them, somehow or other getting the constituents of the combinations themselves right, but once again not knowing these same things when they are transferred into the long syllables of things and the ones that are not easy? There would be absolutely nothing surprising in it. Right, my friend. How can anyone begin from false belief and get to even a small part of the truth and so acquire wisdom? I dare say it's impossible. Well, if that's the way it is, the two of us would not at all be in the wrong in having first attempted to see the nature of models as a whole in the specific case of a further insignificant model, with the intention then of bringing to the case of the king, which is of the greatest importance, something of the same form from less significant things somewhere, in an attempt once more through the use of a model to recognize in an expert, systematic way what looking after people in the city is, so that it may be present to us in our waking state instead of in a dream? Absolutely right. Then we must take up once again what we were saying before, to the effect that since tens of thousands of people dispute the role of caring for cities with the kingly class, what we have to do is to separate all these off and leave the king on his own, and it was just for this purpose that we said we needed a model. Very much so. So what model involving the same activities as statesmanship on a very small scale could one compare with it, and so discover in a satisfactory way what we are looking for? By Zeus, Socrates, what do you think? If there isn't anything else to hand, well, what about weaving? Do you want us to choose that? Not all of it, if you agree, since perhaps the weaving of cloth from wool will suffice. Maybe it is this part of it, if we choose it, which would provide the testimony we want. I've certainly no objection. Why then, don't we now do the very same thing with weaving that we did in what preceded, dividing each thing by cutting it into parts and then cutting them? We'll get back to what is useful in the present context after covering everything as briefly and quickly as we can. What do you mean? I shall make my answer to you by just going through it. An excellent suggestion. Well then, all the things we make and acquire are either for the sake of our doing something, or they prevent some things happening to us. Of preventives, some are charms, whether divine or human, warding things off, others forms of defence. Of forms of defence, some are ways of arming for war, other forms of protection. Of forms of protection, some are screens, others means of warding off cold and hot weather. Of the latter type of protectives, some are shelters, others coverings. Of coverings, one sort consists of things spread under, a different sort of things put round. Of things put round, some are cut into one piece, while a different sort are compound. Of the compound, some are perforated, others bound together without perforation. Of the unperforated, some are made of the sinews of things growing from the earth, others of hair. Of those made of hair, some are stuck together by means of water and earth, others are bound together with themselves. It is to these preventives and coverings manufactured from materials that are being bound together with themselves that we give the name clothes. As for the expertise that especially has charge of clothes, just as before we gave the name of statesmanship to the sort of expertise that especially had charge of the state, so too now shall we call this sort the art of clothes making, from the thing itself? And shall we say that weaving too, in so far as it is represented the largest part of the manufacture of clothes, does not differ at all except in nature from this art of clothes making, just as in that other case we said that the art of kingship did not differ from that of statesmanship? Yes, absolutely correct. As for what comes next, let's reflect that someone might perhaps suppose that weaving had been adequately described when put like this, being unable to grasp that it had not yet been divided off from those cooperative arts that border on it, while it had been parcelled off from many other related ones. Tell me, which related ones? You didn't follow what's been said, it seems, so it looks as if we must go back again, starting from the end. If you grasp the kinship in this case, we cut off one related expertise from weaving just now, separating off the putting together of blankets by means of the distinction between putting round and putting under. I understand. What's more, we took away all craft work out of flax, esparto, and what we just now, by analogy, called sinews of plants. Again we divided off both the art of felting and the sort of putting together that uses perforation and sewing. of which the largest is the art of cobbling. Absolutely. Still further, working with skins which look after coverings cut in a single piece, and those sorts of activities that look after shelters, all those involved in building and carpentry in general, and in other sorts of expertise, contriving shelter from inflowing water, all these we took away. Also, all the sorts of expertise in forms of protection that offer preventative products in relation to thefts and violent acts, and those that have to do with carrying out the work of lid making and fixings to doorways, which are assigned as parts of the art of joinery. And we cut away the art of arms manufacture, a segment of that great and varied capacity which is defence production. Then again, our first and immediate move was to divide off the whole of the art of magic, which is concerned with protective charms, and we have left behind, as we might suppose, the very expertise we looked for, which protects us against cold weather, productive of a woolen defence, and called by the name of weaving. Yes, that seems to be so. But put like this, my boy, it is not yet complete. The person who puts his hand first to the production of clothes seems to do the opposite of weaving. How so? The business of weaving, I suppose, is a sort of intertwining. Yes, but in fact what I'm talking about is a matter of breaking apart things that are combined or matted together. What is it you're referring to? The function of the art of the carder, or shall we dare to call the art of carding the art of weaving, and treat the carder as if he were a weaver? Certainly not. And then too, if someone calls the art of manufacturing warp and woof weaving, he is using a name that is not only odd but false. Quite. And what about these cases? Are we to put down the whole of the art of fulling and clothes mending as being no sort of care for clothes, nor as any sort of looking after them? Or shall we refer to all of these too as arts of weaving? Certainly not. Yet all of these will dispute the role of looking after and producing clothes with the capacity which is the art of weaving, conceding a very large part to it, but assigning large shares to themselves too. Certainly. Then again, in addition to these, we must suppose that the sorts of expertise responsible for making the tools through which the products of weaving are completed will also lay claim to being at least a contributory cause of every woven article. Quite correct. So will our account of that part of the art of weaving that we selected be sufficiently definite if we proceed to set it down as finest and greatest of all those sorts of care that exist in relation to woolen clothing? Or would we be saying something true but not clear or complete until such time as we remove all of these too from around it? Correct. Then after this we must do what we're saying we should do, in order that our account may proceed in due order. Quite. Well then, let's look at two sorts of expertise that there are in relation to all the things that people do. Which are they? One which is a contributory cause of production, one which is itself a cause. How so? Those which do not make the thing itself, but which provide tools for those that do, tools which, if they were not present, what has been assigned to each expertise would never be accomplished. These are what I mean by contributory causes, while those that bring the thing itself to completion are causes. That seems to make sense. Then as a next step, shall we call contributory causes all those that are concerned with spindles and shuttles and whatever other tools share in the process of production in relation to garments, calling those that look after and make garments themselves causes? Quite correct. Then among the causes, washing and mending and the whole business of looking after clothes in these sorts of ways, it's perfectly reasonable to encompass this part of the extensive field covered by the art of preparation by calling it all the art of the fuller. Right. Again, carding and spinning and everything relating to the making of clothes itself, which is the thing whose parts we're talking about, all constitute a single expertise among those everybody recognizes, namely woolworking. Of course. Next, there are two segments of wool working, and each of these is a part of two sorts of expertise at once. How so? What has to do with carding and half of the art of the shuttle, and all those activities that set apart from each other things that are together, all of this we can, I suppose, declare as one and as belonging to woolworking itself. And there were, we agreed, two great sorts of expertise in every sphere, that of combination and that of separation. Yes. Well then, it is the art of separation that belong that of carding and all the things just mentioned. For separation in the case of wool and the warp, which happens in different ways in the first case through the shuttle, in the second through use of the hands, has acquired as many names as we referred to a moment ago. Absolutely. Then again, by contrast, let's take a part that is simultaneously a part of combination and of woolworking, and takes place in the latter, and whatever parts of separation there were here, let's let all of them go, cutting wool into two by means of the cut between separation and combination. Count it as divided. Then in its turn, Socrates, you should divide the part that is simultaneously combination and woolworking, if indeed we are going to capture the aforesaid art of weaving. Then I must. Indeed you must. And let's say that part of it is twisting, part intertwining. Do I understand you correctly? By twisting you seem to me to be talking about what relates to the manufacture of the warp. Not only of the warp, but of the woof too, or are we going to find some origin for the woof which doesn't involve twisting? Certainly not. Well, define each of these two things. Perhaps you might find defining them timely. Define them how? Like this, among the products of carding, when its material is drawn out to a certain length and has acquired breadth, do we say that there's a flock of wool? Yes. Of this, then, the yarn that has been twisted by the spindle and been made firm you'll call the warp, and the expertise that guides its production, warp spinning. Correct. But those threads that in their turn get a loose twisting, and have a softness appropriate to the twining in of the warp, but also to what is needed for drawing out in the dressing process, you'll call these the products of the spinning, the woof and expertise that is set over their production. Let's call it woof spinning. Quite correct. And as for the part of weaving that we put forward for investigation, I suppose that's now clear to anyone. When the part of combination which is contained in wool working produces something intertwined, by the regular intertwining of woof and warp, the whole product of the intertwining we refer to as a piece of woolen clothing, and we refer to the expertise that is over this as weaving. Quite correct. Good. So why ever, then, didn't we immediately reply that weaving was an intertwining of woof and warp instead of going round in a circle defining a whole collections of things to no purpose? To me at least, visitor, nothing of what we have said seemed to have been said to no purpose. And that isn't at all surprising, I may say, but perhaps, my dear fellow, it might seem so. So against such a malady, in case it should come upon you later, that wouldn't be at all surprising, listen to a point which it's appropriate to make in all cases like this. Do make it. First, then, let's look at excess and deficiency in general, so that we may distribute praise and censure proportionately on each occasion, when things are said at greater length than necessary, and when the opposite occurs in discussions like the present one. That's what we must do then. If we talked about these very things, I'd think we'd be proceeding correctly. What things? About length and brevity and excess and deficiency in general. I suppose the art of measurement relates to all of these. Yes. Then let's divide it into two parts. That's what we need towards our present objective. Please tell me how we should divide it. This way. One part will relate to the association of greatness and smallness with each other, the other to what coming into being necessarily is. What do you mean? Does it not seem to you that by its nature the greater has to be said to be greater than nothing other than the less, and the less in its turn less than the greater, and than nothing else? It does. What about this? Shan't we also say that there really is such a thing as what exceeds what is in due measure, and everything of that sort, in what we say or indeed in what we do? Isn't it just in that respect that those of us who are bad and those who are good most differ? It seems so. In that case, we must lay it down that the great and the small exist and are objects of judgment in these twin ways. It is not, as we said just before, that we must suppose them to exist only in relation to each other, but rather, as we have now said, that we should speak of their existing in one way in relation to each other, and in another in relation to what is in due measure. Do we want to know why? Of course. If someone will admit the existence of the greater and everything of the sort in relation to nothing other than the less, it will never be in relation to what is in due measure. You agree? That's so. Well, with this account of things we shall destroy, shan't we? Both the various sorts of expertise themselves and their products, and in particular we shall make the one we're looking for now, statesmanship, disappear, and the one we said was weaving. For I imagine all such sorts of expertise guard against what is more and less than what is in due measure, not as something which is not, but as something which is and is troublesome in relation to what they do. It is by preserving measure in this way that they produce all the good and fine things they do produce. Of course. If then we make the art of statesmanship disappear, our search after that for the knowledge of kingship will lack any way forward. Very much so. Is it the case, then, that just as with the sophists we compelled what is not into being as well as what is, when our argument escaped us down that route, so now we must compel the more and less, in their turn, to become measurable, not only in relation to each other, but also in relation to the coming into being of what is in due measure? For if this has not been agreed, it is certainly not possible for either the statesman or anyone else who possesses knowledge of practical subjects to acquire an undisputed existence. Then now too we must do the same as much as we can. This task, Socrates, is even greater than the former one, and we remember what the length of that was. Still, it's very definitely fair to propose the following hypothesis about the subject in question. What's that? That at some time we shall need what I referred to just now for the sort of demonstration that would be commensurate with the precise truth itself. But so far as concerns what is presently being shown, quite adequately for our immediate purposes, the argument we are using seems to me to come to our aid in magnificent fashion. Namely, we should surely suppose that it is similarly the case that all the various sorts of expertise exist, and at the same time that greater and less are measured not only in relation to each other, but also in relation to the coming into being of what is in due measure. For if the latter is the case, then so is the former, and also if it is the case that the sorts of expertise exist, the other is the case too. But if one or the other is not the case, then neither of them will ever be. This much is right, but what's the next move after this? It's clear that we would divide the art of measurement, cutting it in two in just the way we said, positing as one part of it all those sorts of expertise that measure the number, lengths, depths, breadths, and speeds of things in relation to what is opposed to them, and as the other, all those that measure in relation to what is in due measure, what is fitting the right moment, what is as it ought to be, everything that removes itself from the extremes to the middle. Each of the two sections you refer to is indeed a large one, and very different from the other. Yes, Socrates, and what many sophisticated people sometimes say, supposing themselves to be expressing something clever, to the effect that there is in fact an art of measurement relating to everything that comes into being, that's actually the very thing we have just said. For it is indeed the case, in a certain way, that all the products of the various sorts of expertise share in measurement. But because of their not being accustomed to carrying on their investigations by dividing according to real classes, the people in question throw these things together at once, despite the degree of difference between them, linking them alike, and then again they also do the opposite of this, by dividing other things not according to parts, when the rule is that when one perceives first the community between the members of a group of many things, one should not desist until one sees in it all those differences that are located in classes, and conversely, with the various unlikenesses, when they are seen in multitudes, one should be incapable of pulling a face and stopping before one has penned all the related things within one likeness, and actually surrounded them in some real class. So let this be enough for us to say about these things, and about modes of defect and excess, and let's just keep hold of the fact that two distinct classes of measurement have been discovered in relation to them, and remember what we say they are. We'll remember. Well then, after this point, let's admit another one that relates both to the very things we are inquiring into and to the whole business of discussions of this sort. What's that? What if someone put the following question about our pupils sitting together learning their letters? When one of them is asked what letters make up some word or other, are we to say that for him on that occasion the inquiry takes place more for the sake of the single question set before him, or for the sake of his becoming more able to answer all questions relating to letters? Clearly for the sake of his being able to answer all. What then about our inquiry now about the Statesman? Has it been set before us more for the sake of that very thing, or for the sake of our becoming better dialecticians in relation to all subjects? That's clear too, for the sake of our becoming better dialecticians generally. I certainly don't suppose that anyone with any sense would want to hunt down the definition of weaving for the sake of weaving itself, but I think the majority of people fail to recognize that for some of the things there are certain perceptible likenesses which are there to be easily understood, and which it is not at all hard to point out when one wants to make an easy demonstration, involving no trouble and without recourse to verbal means, to someone who asks for an account of one of these things. Conversely, for those things that are greatest and most valuable, there is no image at all which has been worked in plain view for the use of mankind, the showing of which will enable the person who wants to satisfy the mind of an inquirer to satisfy it adequately just by fitting it to one of the senses. That is why one must practice at being able to give and receive an account of each thing, for the things that are without body, which are finest and greatest, are shown clearly only by verbal means and by nothing else, and everything that is now being said is for the sake of these things. But practice in everything is easier in small things rather than in relation to the greater. Very well said. Well then, let's remind ourselves of the reason why we've said all these on these subjects. Why did we say it all? Not least because of the difficulty we found in accepting the length of our talk about weaving, and about the reversal of the universe, and about the being of the non-being which is the sphere of the sophist. We reflected that it had a rather great length, and in all these cases we rebuked ourselves out of fear that what we were saying would turn out to be superfluous as well as long. So the thing for you to say is that the foregoing was for the sake of all of those cases, in order that we shan't suffer any of this sort of misgiving on any future occasion. I shall do as you say. Tell me what comes next. Well, I say that you and I must be careful to remember what we have now said, and to distribute censure and praise of both shortness and length, whatever subjects we happen to be talking about on each occasion, by judging lengths not in relation to each other, but, in accordance with the part of the art of measurement we previously said we must remember, in relation to what is fitting. Correct. Well, that's right, but we mustn't refer everything to this. For one thing, we shan't have any need for a length that fits in relation to pleasure, except perhaps as an incidental consideration. And again, as for what contributes towards the inquiry into the subject set before us, what we have said commits us to making a second and not a first priority of the question, how we might find it most easily and quickly, and to give by far the greatest and primary value to the pursuit itself of the ability to divide by classes. In particular, if an account is very long but renders the hearer better at discovering things, our business is to take this one seriously and not feel at all irritated at its length, and similarly if a shorter one in its turn has the same effect. Then again, over and above this, if in relation to such discussions someone finds fault with the length of what is said, and will not put up with going round in circles, we must not let such a person go just like that without a backward glance, with his having made the simple complaint that what has been said has taken a long time. We should think it right that he should also demonstrate, in addition, that if it had been shorter it would make the partners in the discussion better dialecticians and better at discovering how to display in words the things there are. We shall take no notice at all of the other sorts of censure and praise relating to some other criteria, nor even seem to hear such things at all when they are said. Now enough of these things. If I have your agreement too, let's go back again to the Statesman and bring the model of weaving, which we talked about before, to bear on it. Well said. Let's do what you say. Well then, the king has been separated off from the many sorts of expertise that share his field, or rather from all of them concerned with herds. There remain, we are saying, those sorts of expertise in the city itself that are contributory causes, and those that are causes, which we must first divide from each other. Correct. Do you recognize that it is difficult to cut them into two? The cause, I think, will become more evident if we proceed. Well then, that's what we should do. Then let's divide them limb by limb like a sacrificial animal, since we can't do it into two, for we must always cut into the nearest number so far as we can. So how are we to do it in this case? Just as before, the sorts of expertise that provided tools relating to weaving, all of these, of course, we put down then as contributory causes. Yes, we must do the same thing now too, but to a still greater degree than we did then, for we must put down as being contributory causes all the sorts of expertise that produce any tool in the city, whether small or large. Without these there would never come to be a city nor statesmanship, but on the other hand we shan't, I think, put down any of them as the product of the expertise of the king. No, we shan't. And yet we're trying to do a difficult thing in separating this class of things from the rest. In fact, it is possible for someone to treat anything you like as a tool of something and seem to have said something credible. Nevertheless, among the things people possess in a city, let's treat the following as being of a different sort. Different in what way? Because it does not have the same capacity that tools have, for it is not put together with the purpose of causing the coming into being of something, as a tool is, but for the sake of preserving what craftsmen have produced. What do you mean? That varied class of things which is worked for things liquid and solid, and for things that are prepared on the fire, and things that are not, what we refer to with the single name of vessel, a common class, and one that, I think, simply does not belong at all to the sort of expert knowledge we are looking for. Certainly not. We must then observe a third very extensive class of things that people possess, different from these others, which is found on land and water, moves about a lot and is fixed, and is accorded high value and none but has a single name, because it is all for the sake of some supporting or other, always being a seat for something. What do you mean? I suppose we call it by the name of vehicle, not at all a product of the art of statesmanship, but much more of those of carpentry, pottery, and bronze-working. I see. And what is the fourth? Should we say that it is something different from these, something that includes the larger part of the things we mentioned before, all clothing, most armour and walls, all those encirclements made out of earth or out of stone, and tens of thousands of other things, since all of them together are worked for the purpose of defending? It would be most apposite to call the whole class that of defence, and it would be thought to be a product much more of the expertise of the builder and the weaver, most of it more correctly than it would be thought to belong to that of the statesman. Absolutely. Would we want to put down as a fifth class things to do with decoration, painting, and those presentations that are completed by the use of painting and of music which have been executed solely to give us pleasures, and which would appropriately be embraced by a single name? What name? I think we talk about something. we call a plaything? Of course. Well, this one name will be fittingly given to all of them, for not one of them is for the sake of a serious purpose, but all are done for amusement. This too I pretty well understand. And what provides materials for all these things, from which and in which all of the sorts of expertise that have now been mentioned work, a varied class that is itself the offspring of many other sorts of expertise. Shall we not put it down as a sixth? What exactly are you referring to? Gold and silver and everything that is mined, and all that the art of tree felling and any lopping cuts and provides for the art of the carpenter and the basket weaver, and again the art of stripping off the outer covering of plants, and the one that removes skins from bodies of living things, the art of the skinner, and all the sorts of expertise there are in relation to such things, which by producing cork and papyrus and materials for bindings makes possible the working up of classes of composite things from classes of things that are not put together. Let us call it all one thing, the firstborn and incomposite possession of mankind, which is in no way a product of the knowledge of kingship. Right. Then again, that sort of possession that consists in nutrition and all those things which, when they are blended into the body, their own parts with parts of the body, have a capacity for promoting its care, we must say is a seventh, calling it altogether nurture, unless we have some more attractive term to propose. And if we place it under the arts of the farmer, the hunter, the trainer in the gymnasium, the doctor and the cook, we shall be assigning it more correctly than if we give it to the art of the statesman. Of course. Well then, we have, I think, pretty well dealt in these 7 classes with all the things that have to do with possessions, with the exception of tame living creatures. Look at our list. It would be most appropriate if we put down the firstborn class of things at the beginning, and after this tool, vessel, vehicle, defence, plaything, nourishment. If anything of no great importance has escaped us, we leave it to one side, because it is capable of fitting into one or other of these, for example, the class consisting of currency, seals, and any sort of engraving. For these do not have any great shared class among them, but if some of them are dragged off into decoration, others into tools, it will be forcibly done, but nevertheless they'll wholly agree to it. As for what relates to possession of tame living creatures, apart from slaves, the art of herd rearing which we divided into its parts before, will clearly be seen to have caught them all. Absolutely. Then what remains is the class of slaves and all those people who are subordinate to others, among whom I strongly suspect those who dispute with the king about the woven fabric itself will come into view, just as in the case of weaving we found those concerned with spinning and carding and all the other things we mentioned disputing with the weavers over their product. All the others who have been described as contributory causes have been disposed of along with the products we have just listed, as each was separated off from the practical activity which is the sphere of the art of kingship and statesmanship. So it seems, at any rate. Come along then, let's get up close to those people that are left and take a look at them, so that we may get a firmer knowledge of them. That's what we should do. Well, those who are subordinate to the greatest degree, looked at from our present perspective, we find possessing a function and condition which are the opposite of what we suspected just now. Who are they? Those who are bought and acquired as possessions by this means, people whom we can indisputably call slaves, and who least pretend to kingly expertise. Quite. What then of all those among free men who voluntarily place themselves in the service of those we have been discussing, conveying their products, the products of farming and the other sorts of expertise, between them and establishing equality between these products, some in marketplaces, others moving from one city to another, whether by sea or by land, exchanging currency, both for everything else and for itself, people to whom we give the names of money changers, merchants, ship owners, and retailers. Surely they won't lay claim at all to the art of statesmanship. It may be, perhaps, that they will, to the sort that has to do with commercial matters. But those we see placing themselves with complete readiness at the service of all for hire as day labourers, these we shall never find pretending to kingly expertise. Quite so. What in that case are we to say about those who perform services of the following sorts for us whenever we need them? What services do you mean? And who is it you're talking about? Among others, the tribe of heralds and all those who become accomplished at writing by having repeatedly given their services in this respect, and certain others who are very clever at working through many different tasks relating to public offices. What shall we call these? What you called them just now, subordinates, and not themselves rulers in cities. But I certainly wasn't dreaming, I think, when I said that somewhere here there would appear those who particularly lay claim to the art of statesmanship, and yet it would seem very odd indeed to look for them in some portion of the subordinate arts. Yes, quite. Then let's get still closer to those we haven't yet cross-examined. There are those who have a part of a subordinate sort of expert knowledge in relation to divination, for they are, I believe, considered to be interpreters from gods to men. Yes. And then too the class of priests in its turn has, as custom tells us, expert knowledge about the giving through sacrifices of gifts from us to the gods which are pleasing to them, and about asking from them through prayers for the acquisition of good things for us. I imagine that both of these things are parts of a subordinate art. It appears so, at any rate. Well now, it seems to me that at this point we are, as it were, getting close to some sort of trail leading to our destination, for the type of priests and seers is filled full of self-importance and gets a lofty reputation because of the magnitude of what they undertake, so that in Egypt it is not even permitted for a king to hold office without also exercising that of priest. If in fact he happens to have acceded to power at the beginning by force from another class, it is later necessary for him to be initiated into the class of priests. And again among the Greeks too, in many places, it is to the greatest offices that one would find being assigned the performance of the greatest of the sacrifices in relation to such things. And in fact what I'm saying receives the clearest illustration in your case, for they say that the most solemn and ancestral of the ancient sacrifices are assigned here to the person who becomes king by lot. Most certainly. Well then, we must look at these king priests by lot and their subordinates, and also at a certain other very large crowd of people which has just become visible to us, now that the previous ones have been separated off. But who are the people you mean? Some very odd people indeed. How exactly? It's a class mixed out of all sorts, or so it seems to me as I look at it just now, for many of these men resemble lions and centaurs and other such things, and very many resemble satyrs and those animals that are weak but versatile, and they quickly exchange their shapes and capacity for action for each other's. And yet now, Socrates, I think I have identified the men in question. Please explain. You seem to have something odd in view. Yes, it's a universal experience that not recognizing something makes it odd, and this is exactly what happened to me just now. At the moment when I first saw the chorus of those concerned with the affairs of cities, I failed to recognize them. What chorus? That of the greatest magician of all the sophists, and the most versed in their expertise, although removing him from among those who really are in possession of the art of statesmanship and kingship is a very difficult thing to do. Remove him we must, if we are going to see plainly what we are looking for. We must certainly not let this slip. Certainly not, if you ask my view. So tell me this. What? We recognize monarchy, don't we, as one of the varieties of rule in cities? Yes. After monarchy, one would, I think, list the holding of power by the few. Of course. And isn't a third type of constitution rule by the mass of the people, called by the name of democracy? Most certainly. So there are three of them, but don't they in a certain way become five, giving birth from among them to two other names in addition to themselves? What are these? I think that as things are, people refer to the aspects of force and consent, poverty and wealth, and law and lawlessness, as they occur in them, and use these to divide each of the first two types into two. So they call monarchy by two names on the grounds that it exhibits two forms, the one tyrannical, the other kingly monarchy. Of course. And any city which has come to be controlled by a few people, they call by the names of aristocracy and oligarchy. Most certainly. With democracy, on the other hand, whether in fact it's by force or with their consent that the mass rules over those who possess the wealth, and whether by accurately preserving the laws or not, in all these cases no one is in the habit of changing its name. True. What then? Do we suppose that any of these constitutions is correct, when it is defined by these criteria, one, few and many, wealth and poverty, force and consent, and whether it turns out to be accompanied by written laws or without laws? Why? What actually prevents it? Look at it more clearly, following this way. Which? Shall we abide by what we said when we first began, or shall we be in discord with it? What was that? We said, I think, that kingly rule was one of the sorts of expert knowledge. Yes. And not just one of them all, but we chose out from the rest particularly one that was concerned in a sense with making judgments and controlling. Yes. And then from the controlling sort we took one that was set over inanimate products and one set over living creatures, and it's by splitting things up in just this way that we have been progressing all the time to the point where we are now. We haven't forgotten that it's knowledge, but as for what sort of knowledge it is, we're not yet able to give a sufficiently accurate answer. Your account is correct. Then do we see just this very point, that the criterion in the things in question must not be few nor many, nor consent nor the lack of it, nor poverty nor wealth, but some sort of knowledge, if indeed we are going to be consistent with what we said before? But that we can't possibly fail to do. Necessarily, then, we must now consider in which, if any, of these types of rule expert knowledge about ruling human beings turns out to occur. Practically the most difficult and the most important thing of which to acquire knowledge. For we must catch sight of it in order to consider which people we must remove from the wise king's company, who pretend to possess of the art of statesmanship and persuade many people that they do, but in fact do not have it at all. Yes, we must indeed do this, as our argument has already told us. Well, does it seem that a mass of people in the city are capable of acquiring this expertise? How could they? But in a city of 1,000 men, is it possible for 100 or so, or again 50, to acquire it adequately? In that case, it would be quite the easiest of all the sorts of expertise there are, for we know that among 1,000 men there would never be so many top pettier players in relation to those among the rest of the Greeks, let alone kings. For it is that man who actually possesses the expert knowledge of kingship, whether he rules or not, who must in any case be called an expert in kingship, according to what we said before. You've remembered well. As a consequence of this, I think we must look for correct rule in relation to some one person, or two, or altogether few, when it is correct. We certainly must. Yes, but these people, whether they rule over willing or unwilling subjects, whether according to written laws or without them, and whether they rule as rich men or poor, we must suppose, as is now our view, to be carrying out whatever sort of rule they do on the basis of expertise. Doctors provide the clearest parallel. We believe in them whether they cure us with our consent or without it, by cutting or burning or applying some other painful treatment, and whether they do so according to written rules or apart from written rules, and whether as poor men or rich. In all these cases we are no less inclined at all to say they are doctors, so long as they are in charge of us on the basis of expertise, purging or otherwise reducing us, or else building us up. It is no matter, if only each and every one of those who care for our bodies, acts for our bodies is good, making them better than they were, and so preserves what is in their care. It's in this way, as I think, and in no other, that we lay down the criterion of medicine and of any other sort of rule whatsoever. It is the only correct criterion. Yes, just so. It must then be the case, it seems, that of constitutions too, the one that is correct in comparison with the rest, and alone a constitution, is the one in which the rulers would be found truly possessing expert knowledge, and not merely seeming to do so, whether they rule according to laws or without laws, over willing or unwilling subjects, and whether the rulers are poor or wealthy. There is no principle of correctness according to which any of these must be taken into any account at all. Right. And whether they purge the city for its benefit by putting some people to death, or else by exiling them, or whether again they make it smaller by sending out colonies somewhere like swarms of bees, or build it up by introducing people from somewhere outside and making them citizens, so long as they act to preserve it on the basis of expert knowledge, and what is just, making it better than it was so far as they can, this is the constitution which alone we must say is correct under these conditions and in accordance with criteria of this sort. All the others that we generally say are constitutions we must say are not genuine, and not really constitutions at all, but imitations of this one. Those we say are law-abiding have imitated it for the better, the others for the worse. The rest of it, visitor, seems to have been said in due measure, but that ideal rule may exist even without laws was something harder for a hearer to accept. You got in just a little before me with your question, Socrates, for I was about to ask you whether you accept all of this, or whether in fact you find any of the things we have said difficult to take. But as it is, it's ready apparent that we'll want a discussion of this matter, of the correctness of those who rule without laws. Quite. Now, in a certain sense, it is clear that the art of the legislator belongs to that of the king. But the best thing is not that the laws should prevail, but rather the kingly man who possesses wisdom. Do you know why? What then is the reason? That law could never accurately embrace what is best and most just for all at the same time, and so prescribe what is best. For the dissimilarities between human beings and their actions, and the fact that practically nothing in human affairs ever remains stable, prevent any sort of expertise whatsoever from making any simple decision in any sphere that covers all cases and will last for all time. I suppose this is something we agree about? Certainly. But we see law bending itself more or less towards this very thing. It resembles some self-willed and ignorant person who allows no one to do anything contrary to what he orders, nor to ask any questions about it, not even if, after all, something new turns out for someone which is better, contrary to the prescription which he himself has laid down. True, the law does absolutely, as you have just said, with regard to each and every one of us. Then it's impossible for what is perpetually simple to be useful in relation to what is never simple. Very likely. Why, then, is it ever necessary to make laws, given that law is not something completely correct? We must find out the cause of this. Certainly. Now, with you too, people train in groups in the way they do in other cities, whether for running or for anything else, for competitive purposes. Yes, very frequently. Well, now let's recall to mind the instructions that expert trainers give when they're in charge of people in such circumstances. What are you thinking of? That they don't suppose there is room for them to make their prescriptions piece by piece to suit each individual, giving the instruction appropriate to the physical condition of each. They regard it as necessary to make rougher prescriptions about what will bring physical benefit as suits the majority of cases and a large number of people. Right. And it's just for this reason that, as it is, they give equally heavy exercises to the group as a whole, starting them off together and stopping them together in their running, wrestling, and the rest of their physical exercises. That so? Then let's suppose the same about the legislator too, the person who will direct his herds in relation to justice and their contracts with one another. He will never be capable, in prescribing for everyone together, of assigning accurately to each individual what is appropriate for him. What you say certainly sounds reasonable. Instead, he will, I think, set down the law for each and every one according to the principle of for the majority of people, for the majority of cases, and roughly somehow like this, whether expressing it in writing or in unwritten form, legislating by means of ancestral customs. Correct. Yes, it certainly is. For how would anyone ever be capable, Socrates, of sitting beside each individual perpetually throughout his life and accurately prescribing what is appropriate to him? Since in my view, if he were capable of this, any one of those who had really acquired the expert knowledge of kingship would hardly put obstacles in his own way by writing down these laws we talked about. It certainly follows from what we have now said, visitor. Yes, but more, my good friend, from the things that are going to be said. And what are they? Things like the following. Are we to say, that is, between us, that if a doctor or else some gymnastic trainer were going to be out of the country and away from his charges for what he thought would be a long time, and thought that the people being trained or his patients would not remember the instructions he had given them, he would want to write down reminders for them, or what are we to say? As you suggested. But what if he came back unexpectedly, having been away for less time than he thought he would be? Do you think he wouldn't propose other prescriptions, contrary to the ones he had written down, when things turned out to be different and better for his patients, because of winds or else some other of the things that come from Zeus, which had come about contrary to expectation in some way different from the usual pattern? Would he obstinately think that neither he nor the patient should step outside those ancient laws that had once been laid down, he himself by giving other instructions, the patient by daring to do different things contrary to what was written down, on the grounds that these were the rules of the art of medicine and of health, and that things that happened differently were unhealthy and not part of his expertise? Or would all such things, if they happened in the context of truly expert knowledge, cause altogether the greatest ridicule in all spheres for acts of legislation of this sort? Absolutely right. And as for the person who has written down what is just and unjust, fine and shameful, good and bad, or has laid down unwritten laws on these subjects for all those herds of human beings that graze city by city according to the laws of those who wrote them down in each case, if the person who wrote them on the basis of expertise, or someone else resembling him, arrives, is it really not to be permitted to him to give different instructions contrary to these? Or wouldn't this prohibition appear in truth no less ridiculous than the other one? Of course. Well then, do you know what the majority of people say in such a case? It doesn't come to mind for the moment, just like that. Well, it sounds fine enough. What they say is that if someone recognizes laws that are better, contrary to those established by people before him, then he must introduce them by persuading his city to accept them in each case, but not otherwise. Well then, Is that not a correct view? Perhaps. But first things first, if someone forces through what is better without the use of persuasion, tell me, what will be the name to give to the use of force in this case? No, not yet. Answer me first in relation to the previous cases. What do you mean? If then, to continue with our example, someone does not persuade his patient, but has a correct grasp of the relevant expertise, and forces child or man or woman to do what is better, contrary to what has been written down, what will be the name to give to this use of force? Surely anything rather than what we called an unhealthy mistake contrary to the expertise in question. And the last thing the person who was the object of such force can correctly say about such a thing is that he had unhealthy things done to him by the doctors who used force on him, things that did not belong to their expertise. What you say is very true. And what do we really suppose to be the sort of mistake we're talking about? The one in contravention of the expertise of the statesman. Isn't it what is shameful, what is bad and unjust? I agree absolutely. Then those who have been forced, contrary to what has been written down, and to ancestral custom, to do different things that are more just, better and finer than the things they did before, tell me, if people in this kind of situation, for their part, censure this kind of use of force, isn't it true that, if their censure isn't to be the most laughable of all, they must say anything on each occasion rather than those who have been forced have had shameful, unjust, and bad things done to them by those who did the forcing? What you say is very true. But are the things forced on them just if the person who did the forcing is rich, and unjust if he happens to be poor? Or if, whether by using persuasion or not, whether as a rich or a poor man, or according to written law or contrary to it, he does what is not to the benefit of the citizens, or what is to their benefit, must that be the criterion, and must it have to do with these things, the truest criterion of correct government of a city, the one according to which the wise and good man will govern the interests of the ruled? Just as a steersman, always watching out for what is to the benefit of the ship and the sailors, preserves his fellow sailors not by putting things down in writing, but offering his expertise as law, so too in this same manner a constitution would be correct, would it not, if it issued from those who are able to rule in this way, offering the strength of their expertise as more powerful than the laws? And there is no mistake, is there, for the wise rulers, whatever they do, provided that they watch for one great thing, that by always distributing to those in the city what is most just, as judged by the intelligent application of their expertise, they are able both to preserve them and so far as they can to bring it about that they are better than they were. It is certainly not possible to contradict what has just been said, and neither should one contradict those other things we said. What are you referring to? That a mass of any people whatsoever would never be able to acquire this sort of expert knowledge and so govern a city with intelligence, and that we must look for that one constitution, the correct one, in relation to a small element in the population, few in number, or even a single individual, putting down the other constitutions as imitations, as we said a little earlier, some of them imitating this one for the better, the others for the worse. What do you mean by this? What are you saying? For I did not understand the point about imitations when it was made just now either. And it's no small matter. If one stirs up this subject and then proceeds to leave it where it is instead of going through it and showing the mistake that now occurs in relation to it. What mistake is that? This sort of thing we must hunt for, since it is not altogether what we are used to or easy to see. But all the same, let's try to get hold of it. Tell me, given that this constitution we have talked about is on our view the only correct one, do you recognize that the others ought to employ the written documents that belong to this one and save themselves in that way doing what is now praised, although it is not the most correct thing to do? What are you referring to? The principle that no one in the city should dare to do anything contrary to the laws, and that the person who dares to do so should be punished by death and all the worst punishments. This is very correct and fine as a second choice when one changes the principle we discussed just now, which is our first choice, but let us go over the way in which what we have called second best has come about. Do you agree? Absolutely. Well then, let's go back to the likenesses to which we must always compare our kingly rulers. Which likenesses? The noble steersman and the doctor who is worth many others. Let us look at the matter by fashioning a kind of figure using these as material. A figure of what kind? Of the following sort. Let's suppose that we all thought of them as doing the most terrible things to us. For the one as much as the other saves whichever of us he wishes to save, and whichever of us they wish to mutilate, they do it by cutting and burning us, and directing us to pay them expenses, as if they were taxes, of which they spend little or none on the patient, while they themselves and their household use the rest. And the final step is for them to take money from relatives, or some enemies of the patient as pay for killing him. And steersmen in their turn bring about thousands of other things of a similar sort, leaving people stranded on voyages because of some conspiracy or other, causing shipwrecks on the seas and throwing people overboard, and doing other malicious things. Let's suppose, then, that we thought this, and came to a conclusion about them in a sort of council, no longer to allow either of these sorts of expertise to have autonomous control either of slaves or of free men, but to call together an assembly with ourselves as members, consisting either of the people altogether, or only of the rich. The rule would be that both laymen and craftsmen, other than steersmen and doctors, would be permitted to contribute an opinion, whether about sailing or about diseases. As to the basis on which drugs and the tools of the doctor's art should be used on patients, and even how to employ ships themselves and the tools of the sailor's art for operating them, for facing not only the dangers affecting the voyage itself from winds and sea, but encounters with pirates, and perhaps, if it should turn out to be necessary, for fighting a sea battle with long ships against others of the same type. And once there was a record on curbeis, or blocks of stones of some sort, of what the majority had decided, whether with the advice of some doctors and steersmen, or of those who had no specialized knowledge of medicine or steersmanship. Then all our sailing and caring for patients for all future time would have to be done according to this, along with certain other rules established as unwritten ancestral customs. What you've described is distinctly odd. Yes, and let's suppose that a further conclusion was that we should set up officers annually who belonged to the mass of people, whether from the rich or from the whole people, whoever has office assigned to him by lot, and that those who take office should execute it by steering the ships and healing patients according to the written rules. This is even harder to take. Then consider too what follows after this. When the year ends for each and every one of the officers, there will be a requirement to set up courts, either of the rich on the basis of pre-selection, or again those chosen by lot from the whole people together, and to bring before these judges those who have held office, in order to examine their conduct. Anyone who wishes will be permitted to charge an officer that he failed to steer the ships during the year according to the written rules, or according to the ancient customs of our ancestors. There will be these same requirements also in the case of those healing the sick, and for any officers condemned by the vote, the judges will have to assess what penalty they should suffer, or what financial restitution they should make. Well, anyone who willingly and voluntarily undertakes to hold office under such conditions would fully deserve to suffer any penalty whatever, and to pay back any amount. And further still, it will be necessary to establish a law against all the following things. Suppose anyone is found inquiring into steersmanship and seafaring, or health and truth in the doctor's art, in relation to winds and heat and cold, above and beyond the written rules, and making clever speculations of any kind in relation to such things. In the first place, one must not call him an expert doctor or an expert steersman, but a star-gazer, some babbling sophist. The next provision will be that anyone who wishes from among those permitted to do so shall indict him and bring him before some court or other as corrupting other people younger than himself, and inducing them to engage in the arts of the steersman and the doctor not in accordance with the laws, but instead by taking autonomous control of ships and patients. If he is found guilty of persuading anyone, whether young or old, contrary to the laws of the written rules, the most extreme penalties shall be imposed on him. For, so the law will say, there must be nothing wiser than the laws. No one is ignorant about what belongs to the art of the doctor, or about health, or what belongs to the art of the steersman or seafaring, since it is possible for anyone who wishes to understand things that are written down and things established as ancestral customs. Suppose then these things came about, Socrates, in the way we say, both in relation to these sorts of expert knowledge and to generalship, and all the art of hunting, of whatever kind, to painting, or any part whatever of all the art of imitation, to carpentry, the whole of tool making of whatever kind, or again farming, and the whole of the expertise that deals with plants. Or again, suppose we imagined a sort of horse rearing that took place according to written rules, or all of herd keeping, or the art of divination, or every part included in the art of the subordinate, or petea, or all the science of numbers, whether perhaps dealing with them on their own, or in 2 dimensions, or in solids, or in speeds. If all of these were practiced in this way, and they were done on the basis of written rules and not on the basis of expertise, what on earth would be the result? It's clear both that we should see all the various sorts of expertise completely destroyed, and that they would never be restored either, because of this law prohibiting inquiry, so that life, which even now is difficult, in such a time would be altogether unlivable. But what about the following consideration? Suppose we required each of the things mentioned to be done according to written rules, and we required the person elected or appointed to office by lot, on the basis of chance, to oversee these written rules of ours. What then if this person were to take no notice of what is written down, in order either to profit in some way or to do some personal favour, and were to take it upon himself to do different things contrary to these, when he possesses no knowledge? Would this not be an evil still greater than the previous one? Yes, very true. Yes, for if, I imagine, contrary to the laws that have been established on the basis of much experiment, with some advisers or other having given advice on each subject in an attractive way, and having persuaded the majority to pass them, if someone were brazen enough to act contrary to these, he would be committing a mistake many times greater than the other, and would overturn all expert activity to a still greater degree than do the written rules. Yes, how would he not? For these reasons, then, the second best method of proceeding, for those who establish laws and written rules about anything whatever, is to allow neither individual nor mass ever to do anything contrary to these, anything whatsoever. Correct. Well, imitations of the truth of each and every thing would be these, wouldn't they? The things issuing from those who know which have been written down, so far as they can be. Of course. Now we said, if we remember, that the knowledgeable person, the one who really possesses the art of statesmanship, would do many things in relation to his own activity by using his expertise, without taking any notice of the written laws, when other things appear to him to be better, contrary to those that have been written down by him and given as orders to people who are not currently with him. Yes, that's what we said. Well, any individual, whatever, or any large collection of people, whatever, for whom there are actually written laws established, who undertake to do anything at all that is different, contrary to these, on the grounds that it is better, will be doing, won't they, the same thing as that true expert, so far as they can. Absolutely. Well then, if they were to do such a thing without having expert knowledge, they would be undertaking to imitate what is true, but would imitate it altogether badly. But if they did it on the basis of expertise, this is no longer imitation, but that very thing that is most truly what it sets out to be. I agree completely, I think. But it is established as agreed between us, we agreed to it before at any rate, that no large collection of people is capable of acquiring any sort of expertise whatever. Yes, it remains agreed. Then, if some sort of kingly expertise exists, neither the collection of people that consists of the rich, nor all the people together, could ever acquire this expert knowledge of statesmanship. How could they? The requirement then, as it seems, for all constitutions of this sort, if they are going to produce a good imitation of that true constitution of one man ruling with expertise, so far as they can, is that, given that they have their laws, they must never do anything contrary to what is written or to ancestral customs. Very well said. In that case, when the rich imitate it, then we shall call such a constitution an aristocracy. When they take no notice of the laws, we shall call it an oligarchy. Possibly. And in turn, when one person rules according to laws, so imitating the person with expert knowledge, we shall call him a king, not distinguishing by name the one ruling on his own with expert knowledge, or the one doing so on the basis of opinion, according to laws. Possibly we shall. Well then, if in fact some one person rules who really possesses expert knowledge, in every case he will be called by the name of king, and not by any other one. As a result of this, the 5 names of what are now called constitutions have become only one. It seems so at any rate. And what of the case when some one ruler acts neither according to laws nor according to customs, but pretends to act like the person with expert knowledge, saying that after all one must do what is contrary to what has been written down if it is best, and there is some desire or other combined with ignorance controlling this imitation? Surely in those circumstances we must call every such person a tyrant. Of course. Then it is in this way that the tyrant has come about, we say, and the king, and oligarchy, and aristocracy, and democracy, because people found themselves unable to put up with the idea of that single individual of ours as monarch, and refused to believe that there would ever come to be anyone who deserved to rule in such a way, so as to be willing and able to rule with virtue and expert knowledge, distributing what is just and right correctly to all. They think that a person in such a position always mutilates, kills, and generally maltreats whichever of us he wishes, although, if there were to come to be someone of the sort we are describing, he would be prized and would govern a constitution that would alone be correct in the strict sense, steering it through in happiness. Quite. But as things are, when, as we say, a king does not come to be in cities as a king bee is born in a hive, one individual immediately superior in body and mind, it is necessary, so it seems, for people to come together and write things down, chasing after the traces of the truest constitution. Possibly. Do we wonder then, Socrates, at all the evils that turn out to occur in such constitutions, and all those that will turn out for them, when a foundation of this sort underlies them, one of carrying out their functions according to written rules and customs without knowledge, which, if used by another expertise, would manifestly destroy everything that comes about through it? Or should we rather wonder at something else, namely at how strong a thing a city is by its nature? For in fact cities have suffered such things now for time without limit, but nevertheless some particular ones among them are enduring and are not overturned. Yet many from time to time sink like ships and perish, and have perished, and will perish in the future through the depravity of their steersmen and sailors, who have acquired the greatest ignorance about the greatest things, although they have no understanding at all about what belongs to the art of statesmanship. They think they have completely acquired this sort of expert knowledge, most clearly of them all. Very true. So which of these incorrect constitutions is least difficult to live with, given that they are all difficult, and which the heaviest to bear? Should we take a brief look at this, although a discussion of it will be a side issue in relation to the subject now set before us, and yet, at any rate, in general, perhaps everything that all of us do is for the sake of this sort of thing. We should certainly look at it. Well then, what you should say is that if there are three sorts of constitution, the same one is at the same time exceptionally difficult and easiest. What are you saying? Just this, monarchy. I'm saying rule by a few and rule by many. There were these three sorts of constitution we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion, with which we have now been deluged. Yes, there were. Well then, let's divide these, each single one, into two, and make 6, separating off the correct one from these on its own as a 7th. How so? Out of monarchy, let's make kingly and tyrannical rule. Out of the sort that doesn't involve many, we said there was the auspiciously named aristocracy and oligarchy, while out of the sort that does involve many, there was democracy, which we then called single and put it down as such. But now, in turn, we must put this too down as double. How then? And dividing it by what criterion? By one that is no different from these other cases, even if its name, democracy, is now double, but certainly ruling according to laws and contrary to laws, belongs both to this and to the others. Yes, it does. Well, at the time when we were looking for the correct constitution, this cut was not useful, as we demonstrated in what we said before. But since we have now set that correct constitution to one side, and have put down the rest as necessary, in the case of these, certainly, the criterion of contrary to and abiding by laws cuts each of them in two. It seems so, given what has now been said. Well then, when monarchy is yoked in good written rules, which we call laws, it is best of all 6, but if it is without laws, it is difficult and heaviest to live with. Possibly. And as for the rule of those who are not many, just as few is in the middle between one and a large number, let's suppose it to be middling in both ways, while that of the mass in its turn we may suppose to be weak in all respects and capable of nothing of any importance either for good or for bad as judged in relation to the others, because under it offices are distributed in small portions among many people. For this reason, if all the types of constitution are law-abiding, it turns out to be the worst of them. But if all are contrary to law, the best. And if all are uncontrolled, living in a democracy takes the prize. But if they are ordered, life in it is least livable. And in first place and best by far will be life in the first, except for the 7th. For of all of them, that one we must separate out from the other constitutions like a god from men. This seems both to follow and to be as you say, and we must do as you suggest. So then we must also remove those who participate in all these constitutions, except for the one based on knowledge, as being, not statesmen, but experts in faction. We must say that, as presiding over insubstantial images on the larger scale, they are themselves of the same sort, and that as the greatest imitators and magicians, they turn out to be the greatest sophists among sophists. This term sophist looks as if it has been only too correctly turned round against the so-called experts in statesmanship. So, this is our play, as it were. As we said just now that there was some band of centaurs and satyrs in view, one that we had to set apart from the expertise of the statesman, and now it has been set apart, as we have seen, with great difficulty. It appears so. Yes, but there is something else remaining that is still more difficult than this, by reason of its being both more akin to the kingly class, and closer to it, and harder to understand, and we seem to me to be in a similar situation to that of those who refine gold. How so? I imagine that these craftsmen also begin by separating out earth and stones and many different things, and after these there remain commingled with the gold those things that are akin to it, precious things and only removable with the use of fire, copper, silver, and sometimes adamant, the removal of which through repeated smelting and tested leaves the unalloyed gold that people talk about there for us to see itself alone by itself. Yes, they certainly do say these things happen in this way. Well, it seems that in the same way we have now separated off those things that are different from the expert knowledge of statesmanship, and those that are alien and hostile to it, and that there remain those that are precious and related to it. Among these, I think, are generalship, the art of the judge, and that part of rhetoric which, in partnership with kingship, persuades people of what is just, and so helps in steering through the business of cities. As for these, in what way will one most easily portion them off and show, stripped and alone by himself, that person we are looking for? It's clear that we must try to do this somehow. Well, if it depends on our trying, we'll find him. Music will help us reveal him. Answer me this. What? I imagine we recognize such a thing as the learning of music, and in general of the sorts of expert knowledge involving work with the hands. We do. And what of this, the matter of whether we should learn any one of these or not? Shall we say that this too, in its turn, is a sort of knowledge concerned with these very things, or what shall we say? Yes, we'll say that it is. Then shall we agree that this sort of knowledge is distinct from those? Yes. And shall we agree that no one of them should control any other, or that the others should control this one, or that this one should manage and control all the others together? This one should control them. In that case, you, at any rate, declare it to be your opinion that the one that decides whether one should learn or not should be in control, so far as we are concerned, over the one that is the object of learning and does the teaching. Very much so. And also, in that case, that the one which decides whether one should persuade or not should control the one which is capable of persuading. Of course. Well then, to which sort of expert knowledge shall we assign what is capable of persuading mass and crowd, through the telling of stories and not through teaching? This too is clear, I think. It must be given to rhetoric. And the matter of whether to do through persuasion whatever it may be in relation to some people or other, or else by the use of some sort of force, or indeed to do nothing at all, to what sort of expert knowledge shall we attach this? To the one that controls the art of persuasion in speaking. This would be none other, I think, than the capacity of the statesman. Very well said. This matter of rhetoric, too, seems to have been separated quickly from statesmanship as a distinct class, but subordinate to it. Yes. What should we think about the following sort of capacity in its turn? Which one? The one that decides how to make war against each group of people against whom we should choose to make war. The question is whether we shall say that this is or is not a matter of expertise. And how could we suppose it not to involve expertise, that capacity which is exercised by generalship and all activity concerned with war? And are we to understand as different from this expertise that is able and knows how to reach a considered decision about whether we should make war, or whether we should withdraw in friendly fashion, or are we to take it to be the same as this one? Anyone who was following what was said before must suppose that it is distinct. Shall we then declare our view that it controls it, if in fact we are going to take things in line with what we said before? I say yes. Then what mistress will we even try to propose for so terrifying and important an expertise, the whole of that concerned with war, except the true art of kingship? No other. In that case, we shall not set down the expert knowledge of generals as statesmanship, since it is subordinate. It seems unlikely that we shall. Come on then, let's look at the capacity that belongs to those judges who judge correctly. Absolutely. Well then, does its capacity extend to anything more than taking over from the legislator king all those things that are established as lawful in relation to contracts, and judging by reference to these the things that have been prescribed as just and unjust, providing its own individual excellence by virtue of the fact that it would not be willing to decide the complaints of one citizen against another contrary to the prescription of the legislator through being overcome by presence of some sort, or fears or feelings of compassion, or again by any enmity of friendship? No, the function of this capacity extends, roughly speaking, to what you have said. In that case we discover the power of judges too, not to be that belonging to the king, but to be a guardian of the laws and a subordinate of that other capacity. It seems so at any rate. If then one looks at all the sorts of expert knowledge that have been discussed, it must be observed that none of them has been declared to be statesmanship. For what is really kingship must not itself perform practical tasks, but control those with the capacity to perform them, because it knows when it is the right time to begin and set in motion the most important things in cities, and when it is the wrong time and the others must do what has been prescribed for them. Correct. For this reason, then, the sorts of expertise we have just examined control neither each other nor themselves, but each is concerned with some individual practical activity of its own, and in accordance with the individual nature of the activities in question, has appropriately acquired a name that is individual to it. That seems so at any rate. Whereas the one that controls all of these and the laws, and cares for every aspect of things in the city, weaving everything together in the most correct way, this embracing its capacity with the appellation belonging to the whole, we would, it seems, most appropriately call statesmanship. Yes, absolutely. At this point we'll want, won't we, to pursue it further by reference to the model of the art of weaving, now that all the classes of things in the city have become clear to us. Yes, very much so. Then it seems that we should discuss the intertwining that belongs to kingship, of what kind is and in what way it intertwines to render us what sort of fabric. Clearly. What it seems we have to deal with in that case is certainly a difficult thing to show, but in any case we have to discuss it. To say that part of virtue is in a certain sense different in kind from virtue provides an all too easy target for those expert in disputing statements, if we view things in relation to what the majority of people think. I don't understand. I'll put it again like this. I imagine you think that courage for us constitutes one part of virtue. Certainly. And also that moderation is something distinct from courage, but at the same time that this too is one part of what the other is part of. Yes. Well, we must take our courage in our hands and declare something astonishing in relation to these two. What? That in some sort of way they are extremely hostile to each other and occupy opposed positions in many things. What do you mean? Not in any way the sort of thing people are used to saying, for certainly, I imagine, all the parts of virtue are said to be amicably disposed towards each other, if anything is. Yes. Then we should look with extremely close attention to see whether this is unqualifiedly the case, or whether emphatically some aspects of them admit of dissent in some respect with what is related to them. Yes, please say how we should do so. We should look at the matter in relation to all those things that we call fine, but then go on to place them in two classes which are opposed to each other. Put it still more clearly. Sharpness and speed, whether in bodies or in minds, or in the movement of the voice, whether belonging to the things themselves or as represented in images of them, all those imitations that music and painting too provide, have you ever either praised any of these yourself, or been present to hear someone else praising them? Of course. And do you remember how they do it in every one of such cases? I don't at all. Then would I be able, I wonder, to show it to you in words just as I have it before my mind? Why not? You seem to think this kind of thing easy, but in any case let's consider it in the two opposite sorts of case. Often, and in many activities, whenever we admire speed and vigour and sharpness of mind and body, and again of voice, we speak in praise of it by using a single appellation, that of courage. How so? I think we say sharp and courageous. That's a first example, and fast and courageous, and similarly with vigorous. In every case, it's by applying the name I'm talking about in common to all these sorts of things that we praise them. Yes, but again, in many activities, don't we often praise the class of things that happen gently? Yes, very much so. Well then, don't we express this by saying the opposite of what we say of the other things? How? In that, I think, we say on each occasion that they are quiet and moderate, admiring things done in the mind, and in the sphere of actions themselves that are slow and soft, and also things the voice does that turn out smooth and deep, and all rhythmic movement, and the whole of music when it employs slowness at the right time. We apply to them all the name, not of courage, but of orderliness. Very true. And when, conversely, both of these sets of qualities occur at the wrong time, we change round and censure each of them, assigning them to opposite effect by the names we use. How? By calling them excessive and manic when they turn out sharper than is timely, and appear too fast and hard, and calling things that are too deep and slow and soft, cowardly and lethargic. It's pretty much a general rule that we find that these qualities and the moderate type as a whole, and the courage of the opposite qualities do not mix with each other in the relevant activities, as if they were sorts of thing that had a warring stance allotted to them. Moreover, we shall see that those who possess them in their souls are at odds with each other if we go looking for them. Where do you mean us to look? Both in all the spheres we mentioned just now, and no doubt in many others. For I think, because of their affinity to either set of qualities, they praise some things as belonging to their own kin, and censure those of their opponents as alien, engaging in a great deal of hostility towards each other about a great many things. Very likely. Well, this disagreement of these classes of people is a sort of play, but in relation to the most important things, it turns out to be a disease which is the most hateful of all for cities. In relation to what, do you mean? In relation to the organization of life as a whole. For those who are especially orderly are always ready to live the quiet life, carrying on their private business on their own by themselves. They both associate with everyone in their own city on this basis, and similarly with cities outside their own, being ready to preserve peace of some sort in any way they can. As a result of this passion of theirs, which is less timely than it should be, when they do what they want, nobody notices that they are being unwarlike and making the young men the same, and that they are perpetually at the mercy of those who attack them. The consequence is that within a few years they themselves, their children, and the whole city together often become slaves instead of free men before they have noticed it. What you describe is a painful and terrifying thing to go through. But what about those who incline more towards courage? Isn't it the case that they are always drawing their cities into some war or other because of their desire for a life of this sort, which is more vigorous than it should be, and that they make enemies of people who are both numerous and powerful, and so either completely destroy their own fatherlands or else make them slaves and subjects of their enemies. This too is true. How then can we deny that in these things both of these classes of people always admit of much hostility and dissent between them, even to the greatest degree? There's no way we shall deny it. Then we have found, haven't we, what we were originally looking into, that parts of virtue of no small importance are by nature at odds with each other, and moreover cause those who possess them to be in this same condition. Very likely they do. Then let's take the following point in its turn. What's that? Whether, I suppose, any of the sorts of expert knowledge that involve putting things together voluntarily puts together any at all of the things it produces, even of the lowliest kind, out of bad and good things, or whether every sort of expert knowledge everywhere throws away the bad so far as it can, and takes what is suitable as good, bringing all of this, both like and unlike, together into one, and so producing some single kind of thing with a single capacity. Of course. In that case, neither will what we have decided is by nature truly the art of statesmanship ever voluntarily put together a city out of good and bad human beings. It's quite clear that it will first put them to the test in play, and after the test it will in turn hand them over to those with the capacity to educate them and serve it towards this particular end. It will itself lay down prescriptions for the educators and direct them, in the same way that weaving follows along with the carders, and those who prepare the other things it needs for its own work, prescribing for and directing them, giving indications to each group to finish their products in whatever way it thinks suitable for its own interweaving. Yes, absolutely. In just this very way, it seems to me the art of kingship, since it is this that itself possesses the capacity belonging to the directing art, will not permit the educators and tutors, who function according to law, to do anything in the exercise of their role that will not ultimately result in some disposition which is appropriate to its own mixing role. It calls on them to teach these things alone, and those of their pupils that are unable to share in a disposition that is courageous and moderate, and whatever else belongs to the sphere of virtue, but are thrust forcibly away by an evil nature into godlessness, excess, and injustice. It throws out by killing them, sending them into exile, and punishing them with the most extreme forms of dishonour. At least it is put something like that. And again, those who wallow in great ignorance and baseness, it brings under the yoke of the class of slaves. Quite correct. Then, as for the others, whose natures are capable of becoming composed and stable in the direction of nobility, if they acquire education and, with the help of expertise, of admitting commingling with each other, of these it tries to bind together and intertwine the ones who strain more towards courage, its view being that their firm disposition is as it were like the warp, and the ones who incline towards the moderate, who produce an ample, soft, and, to continue the image, woof-like thread, two natures with opposite tendencies, and it does so in something like the following way. What way is that? First, by fitting together that part of their soul that is eternal with the divine bond, in accordance with its kinship with the divine, and after the divine, in turn fitting together their mortal aspect with human bonds. Again, what do you mean by this? I call divine, when it comes to be in souls, that opinion about what is fine, just, and good, and the opposites of these, which is really true and is guaranteed. It belongs to the class of the more than human. That's certainly a fitting view to take. Then do we recognize that it belongs to the statesman and the good legislator alone to be capable of bringing this very thing about, by means of the music that belongs to the art of kingship, in those who have had their correct share of education, the people we were speaking of just now? That's certainly reasonable. Yes, And let's never call anyone who is incapable of doing this sort of thing by the names we are now investigating. Quite correct. Well then, is a courageous soul that grasps this sort of truth not tamed, and wouldn't it be especially willing, as a result, to share in what is just, whereas if it fails to get a share of it, doesn't it rather slide away towards becoming like some kind of beast? Quite. And what of the case of the moderate sort of nature? If it gets a share of these opinions, doesn't it become genuinely moderate and wise, so far as wisdom goes in the context of life in a city? While if it fails to get a portion of the things we're talking about, doesn't it very appropriately acquire a disgraceful reputation for simple-mindedness? Absolutely. And let's not say, shall we, that this sort of interweaving and bonding, in the case of vicious men in relation to each other, and good men in relation to the vicious, ever turns out to be lasting, nor that any sort of expert knowledge would ever seriously use it in relation to people like this? No, how would it? What I propose we should say is that it only takes root through laws in those dispositions that were both born noble in the first place and have been nurtured in accordance with their nature, and that it is for these that this remedy exists by virtue of expertise. And we said this bonding together is more divine, uniting parts of virtue that are by nature unlike each other and tend in opposite directions. Very true. Yes, and the remaining bonds, which are human, once this divine one exists, are perhaps not difficult at all either to understand or to effect once one has understood them. How then, and what are they? Those that consist in intermarriages and the sharing of children, and in those matters relating to private giving away in marriage. For most people, in the way they handle these things, do not bind themselves together correctly with respect to the procreation of children. Why so? Is there any reason why anyone should seriously concern themselves with censuring the pursuit of wealth and forms of influence in such contexts as if it were worth discussing? None. No, it would be more appropriate for us to discuss those people who pay attention to family types and ask whether they are acting erroneously in some way. Yes, that's reasonable. Well, they act out of entirely the wrong sort of consideration. They go for what is immediately easiest, welcoming those who are much like them, and not liking those who are unlike them, assigning the largest part of their decisions to their feelings of antipathy. How? The moderate, I think, look out for people with the dispositions they themselves possess, and so far as they can, they both marry from among these and marry off the daughters they are giving away back to people of this sort. The type related to courage does just the same thing, seeking after the nature that belongs to itself, when both types ought to do completely the opposite of this. How and why? Because it is in the nature of courage that when it is reproduced over many generations without being mixed with a moderate nature, it comes to a peak of power at first, but in the end it bursts out completely in fits of madness. That's likely. And in its turn, the soul that is too full of reserve and has no admixture of courageous initiative, and is reproduced over many generations in this way, by nature grows more sluggish than is timely, and then, in the end, is completely crippled. It's likely that this too turns out as you say. It was these bonds that I meant when I said that there was no difficulty at all in tying them together once the situation existed in which both types had a single opinion about what was fine and good. For this is the single and complete task of kingly weaving together, never to allow moderate dispositions to stand away from the courageous. Rather, by working them closely into each other as if with a shuttle, through sharing of opinions, through honours, dishonour, esteem, and the giving of pledges to one another, it draws together a smooth and fine woven fabric out of them, as the expression is, and always entrusts offices in cities to these in common. How? By choosing the person who has both qualities to put in charge wherever there turns out to be a need for a single officer, and by mixing together a part of each of these groups where there is a need for more than one. For the dispositions of moderate people when in office are markedly cautious, just and conservative, but they lack bite and a certain sharp and practical keenness. This too certainly seems to be the case. And the dispositions of the courageous in their turn are inferior to the others in relation to justice and caution, but have an exceptional degree of keenness when it comes to action. Everything in cities cannot go well either on the private or on the public level, unless both of these groups are there to give their help. Quite. Then let us say that this marks the completion of the fabric which is the product of the art of statesmanship, the weaving together with regular intertwining of the dispositions of brave and moderate people, when the expertise belonging to the king brings their life together in agreement and friendship and makes it common between them, completing the most magnificent and best of all fabrics, and covering with it all the other inhabitants of cities, both slave and free, and holds them together with this twining and rules and directs without, so far as it belongs to a city to be happy, falling short of that in any respect. Another most excellent portrait, visitor, this one that you have completed for us, of the man who possesses the art of kingship, the statesman.